He perched on a table's edge, his bare legs swinging. "Can't have you wandering near Lannion. Not this week. Next, maybe, but only if you can persuade me that you have a good reason to travel." He smoothed his fair moustache. "And I can be very persuadable." "I wish to pray at the shrine there," Jeanette said. "I would not keep you from your prayers," Sir Simon said. He was thinking that he should have invited her through into the parlour, but in truth he had small appetite for love's games this morning. He had consoled himself for his failure to boil Thomas of Hookton's backside by drinking deep into the darkness, and his belly felt liquid, his throat was dry, and his head was banging like a kettle drum. "Which saint will have the pleasure of hearing your voice?" he asked. "The shrine is dedicated to Eve, who protects the sick. My son has a fever." "Poor boy," Sir Simon said in mock sympathy, then peremptorily ordered a clerk to write the pass for her ladyship. "You will not travel alone, madame?" he asked. "I shall take servants." "You will be better with soldiers. There are bandits everywhere." "I do not fear my own countrymen, Sir Simon." "Then you should," he said tartly. "How many servants?" "2. Sir Simon told the clerk to note 2 companions on the pass, then looked back to Jeanette. "You really would be much safer with soldiers as escort." "God will preserve me," Jeanette said. Sir Simon watched as the ink on the pass was sanded dry and a blob of hot wax was dropped onto the parchment. He pressed a seal into the wax, then held the document to Jeanette. "Maybe I should come with you, madame." "I would rather not travel at all," Jeanette said, refusing to take the pass. "Then I shall relinquish my duties to God," Sir Simon said. Jeanette took the pass, forced herself to thank him, then fled. She half expected that Sir Simon would follow her, but he let her go unmolested. She felt dirty, but also triumphant, because the trap was baited now. Well and truly baited. She did not go straight home, but went instead to the house of the lawyer, Bella, who was still eating a breakfast of blood sausage and bread. The aroma of the sausage put an edge to Jeanette's hunger, but she refused his offer of a plate. She was a countess and he was a mere lawyer, and she would not demean herself by eating with him. Bella straightened his robe, apologized that the parlour was cold, and asked whether she had at last decided to sell the house. "It is the sensible thing to do, madame. Your debts mount." "I shall let you know my decision," she said, "but I have come on other business." Bella opened the parlour shutters. "Business costs money, madame, and your debts, forgive me, are mounting." "It is Duke Charles' business," Jeanette said. "Do you still write to his men of business?" "From time to time," Bella said guardedly. "How do you reach them?" Jeanette demanded. Bella was suspicious of the question, but finally saw no harm in giving an answer. "The messages go by boat to Paimpol," he said, "then overland to Gangon." "How long does it take?" 2 days, 3. It depends if the English are riding the country between Paimpol and Gangon." "Then write to the Duke," Jeanette said, "and tell him from me that the English will attack Lannion at the end of this week. They are making ladders to scale the wall." She had decided to send the message through Bella, for her own couriers were 2 fishermen who only came to sell their wares in La Roche-Derrien on a Thursday, and any message sent through them must arrive too late. Bella's couriers, on the other hand, could reach Gangon in good time to thwart the English plans. Bella dabbed egg from his thin beard. "You are sure, madame?" "Of course I'm sure." She told him about Jacques and the ladders, and about the indiscreet English supervisor, and how Sir Simon had forced her to wait a week before venturing near Lannion on her expedition to the shrine at Louannec. "The Duke," Bella said as he ushered Jeanette to the house door, "will be grateful." Bella sent the message that day, though he did not say it came from the Countess, but instead claimed all the credit for himself. He gave the letter to a shipmaster who sailed that same afternoon, and next morning a horseman rode south from Paimpol. There were no Elquins in the wasted country between the port and the Duke's capital, so the message arrived safely. And in Gangon, which was Duke Charles' headquarters, the farriers checked the war horses' shoes, the crossbowmen greased their weapons, squires scrubbed mail till it shone, and 1,000 swords were sharpened. The English raid on Lannion had been betrayed. Jeanette's unlikely alliance with Thomas had soothed the hostility in her house. Skeet's men now used the river as their lavatory instead of the courtyard, and Jeanette allowed them into the kitchen, which proved useful, for they brought their rations with them, and so her household ate better than it had since the town had fallen, though she still could not bring herself to try the smoked herrings with their bright red, mold-covered skins. Best of all was the treatment given to two importunate merchants who arrived demanding payment from Jeanette and were so badly manhandled by a score of archers that both men left hatless, limping, unpaid, and bloody. "I will pay them when I can," she told Thomas. "Sir Simon's likely to have money on him," he told her. "He is? Only a fool leaves cash where a servant can find it," he said. 4 days after the beating, his face was still swollen and his lips black with blood clots. His rib hurt and his body was a mass of bruises, but he had insisted to Skeet that he was well enough to ride to Lannion. They would leave that afternoon. At midday, Jeanette found him in St. Renan's church. "Why are you praying?" she asked him. "I always do before a fight." "There will be a fight today? I thought you were not riding till tomorrow." "I love a well-kept secret," Thomas said, amused. "We're going a day early. Everything's ready. Why wait?" "Going where?" Jeanette asked, though she already knew. "To wherever they take us," Thomas said. Jeanette grimaced and prayed silently that her message had reached Duke Charles. "Be careful," she said to Thomas, not because she cared for him, but because he was her agent for taking revenge on Sir Simon Cheekle. "Perhaps Sir Simon will be killed," she suggested. "God will save him from me," Thomas said. "Perhaps he won't follow me to Luanic." "He'll follow you like a dog," Thomas said, "but it will be dangerous for you." "I shall get the armor back," Jeanette said, "and that is all that matters." "Are you praying to Saint Renan?" "To Saint Sebastian," Thomas said, "and to Saint Guinefort." "I asked the priest about Guinefort," Jeanette said accusingly, "and he said he had never heard of him." "He probably hasn't heard of St. Wilgefortis either," Thomas said. "Wilgefortis?" Jeanette stumbled over the unfamiliar name. "Who is he?" "She," Thomas said, "and she was a very pious virgin who lived in Flanders and grew a long beard. She prayed every day that God would keep her ugly so that she could stay chaste." Jeanette could not resist laughing. "That isn't true." "It is true, my lady," Thomas assured her. "My father was once offered a hair of her holy beard, but he refused to buy it." "Then I shall pray to the bearded saint that you survive your raid," Jeanette said, "but only so you can help me against Sir Simon. Other than that, I hope you all die." The garrison at Gangome had the same wish, and to make it come true they assembled a strong force of crossbowmen and men-at-arms to ambush the Englishmen on their way to Lannion. But they, like Jeanette, were convinced that La Roche-Derrien's garrison would make their sally on the Friday, and so they did not leave till late on Thursday, by which time Toachsom's force was already within 5 miles of Lannion. The shrunken garrison did not know the English were coming because Duke Charles's war captains, who commanded his forces in Gangome while the Duke was in Paris, decided not to warn the town. If too many people knew that the English had been betrayed, then the English themselves might hear of it, abandon their plans, and so deny the Duke's men the chance of a rare and complete victory. The English expected victory themselves. It was a dry night, and near midnight a full moon slid out from behind a silver-edged cloud to cast Lannion's walls in sharp relief. The raiders were hidden in woods, from where they watched the few sentinels on the ramparts. Those sentinels grew sleepy, and after a time went to the bastions where fires burned, and so they did not see the 6 ladder parties creep across the night fields, nor the 100 archers following the ladders. And still they slept as the archers climbed the rungs, and Toachsom's main force erupted from the woods, ready to burst through the eastern gate that the archers would open. The sentinels died. The first dogs awoke in the town, then a church bell began to ring, and Lannion's garrison came awake, but too late, for the gate was open, and Toachsom's mail-clad soldiers were crying havoc in the dark alleys, while still more men-at-arms and archers were pouring through the narrow gate. Skeet's men were the rear guard, and so waited outside the town as the sack began. Church bells were clanging wildly as the town's parishes woke to nightmare, but gradually the clangor ceased. Will Skeet stared at the moon-glossed fields south of Lanio. "I hear it was Sir Simon Jekyll who improved your looks," he said to Thomas. "It was. Because you told him to boil his ass." Skeet grinned. "You can't blame him for thumping you," Skeet said, "but he should have talked to me first." "What would you have done?" "Made sure he didn't thump you too much, of course," Skeet said, his gaze moving steadily across the landscape. Thomas had acquired the same habit of watchfulness, but all the land beyond the town was still. A mist rose from the low ground. "So what do you plan to do about it?" Skeet asked. "Talk to you." "I don't fight your goddamn battles, boy," Skeet growled. "What do you plan to do about it?" "Ask you to lend me Jake and Sam on Saturday, and I want 3 crossbows." "Crossbows, eh?" Skeet asked flatly. He saw that the rest of Tochsom's force had now entered the town, so he put 2 fingers to his lips and sounded a piercing whistle to signal that his own men could follow. "Onto the walls!" he shouted as the Elkin rode forward. "Onto the walls!" That was the rear guard's job, to man the fallen town's defenses. "Half the bloody bastards will still get drunk," Skeet growled, "so you stay with me, Tom." Most of Skeet's men did their duty and climbed the stone steps to the town's ramparts, but a few slipped away in search of plunder and drink, so Skeet, Thomas, and a half-dozen archers scoured the town to find those laggards and drive them back to the walls. A score of Tochsom's men-at-arms were doing much the same, dragging men out of taverns and setting them to loading the many wagons that had been stored in the town to keep them from the Elkin. Tochsom particularly wanted food for his garrison, and his more reliable men-at-arms did their best to keep the English soldiers from drink, women, or anything else that would slow the plunder. The town's garrison, woken and surprised, had done their best to fight back, but they had responded much too late, and their bodies now lay in the moonlit streets. But in the western part of the town, close to the quays which fronted the river Legi, the battle still went on, and Skeet was drawn to the sound. Most men were ignoring it, too intent on kicking down house doors and ransacking warehouses, but Skeet reckoned no one in town was safe until all the defenders were dead. Thomas followed him to find a group of Tochsom's men-at-arms who had just retreated from a narrow street. "There's a mad bastard down there," one of them told Skeet, "and he's got a dozen crossbowmen." The mad bastard and his crossbowmen had already killed their share of Englishmen, for the red-crossed bodies lay where the street bent sharply towards the river. "Burn them out," one of the men-at-arms suggested. "Not before we've searched the buildings," Skeet said, then sent 2 of his archers to fetch one of the ladders that had been used to scale the ramparts. Once the ladder was fetched, he propped it against the nearest house and looked at Thomas, who grinned, climbed the rungs, and then clambered up the steep thatch. His broken rib hurt, but he gained the ridge and there took the bow from his shoulder and fitted an arrow onto the cord. He walked along the rooftop, his moon-cast shadow long on the sloping straw. The roof ended just above the place where the enemy waited, and so, before reaching the ridge's peak, he drew the bow to its full extent, then took 2 steps forward. The enemy saw him, and a dozen crossbows jerked up, but so did the unhelmeted face of a fair-haired man who had a long sword in his hand. Thomas recognized him. It was Sir Geoffrey de Pontblanc, and Thomas hesitated because he admired the man. But then the first bolt whipped so close to his face that he felt the wind of its passing on his cheek, and so he loosed, and he knew the arrow would go straight into the open mouth of Sir Geoffrey's upturned face. He did not see it strike, though, for he had stepped back as the other crossbows twanged and their bolts seared up towards the moon. "He's dead!" Thomas shouted. There was a tramp of feet as the men-at-arms charged before the crossbowmen could reload their clumsy weapons. Thomas stepped back to the ridge's end and saw the swords and axes rise and fall. He saw the blood splash up onto the plastered house fronts, saw the men hacking at Sir Geoffrey's corpse just to make certain he was really dead. A woman shrieked in the house that Sir Geoffrey had been defending. Thomas slithered down the thatch and jumped into the street where Sir Geoffrey had died, and there he picked up 3 of the crossbows and a bag of bolts that he carried back to Will Skeet. The Yorkshireman grinned. "Crossbows, eh? That means you'll be pretending to be the enemy, and you can't do that in La Roche-Derrien. So you're waylaying Sir Simon somewhere outside the town, am I right?" "Something like that. I could read you like a bloody book boy if I could read, which I can't on account of having too much sense." Skeet walked on towards the river, where 3 ships were being plundered, and another 2, their holds already emptied, were burning fiercely. "But how do you get the bastard out of town?" Skeet asked. "He's not a complete fool." "He is when it comes to the Countess." "Ah," Skeet grinned. "And the Countess, she's suddenly being nice to us all. So it's you and her, is it?" "It's not her and me, no." "Soon will be, though, won't it?" Skeet said. "I doubt it." "Why? Because she's a countess, still a woman, boy. But I'd be careful of her." "Careful?" "Ah, bitch, that one. Looks lovely on the outside, but it's all flint inside. She'll break your heart, boy." Skeet had stopped on the wide stone quays, where men were emptying warehouses of leather, grain, smoked fish, wine, and bolts of cloth. Sir Simon was among them, shouting at his men to commandeer more wagons. The town was yielding a vast fortune. It was a much bigger place than La Roche-Derrien, and because it had successfully fought off the Earl of Northampton's winter siege, it had been reckoned a safe place for Bretons to store their valuables. Now it was being gutted. A man staggered past Thomas with an armload of silver plate. Another man was dragging a half-naked woman by the shreds of her nightdress. One group of archers had broken open a vat and were dipping their faces to drink the wine. "It was easy enough getting in here," Skeet said, "but it'll be the devil's own job to get these sodden bastards back out again." Sir Simon beat his sword on the backs of 2 drunks who were getting in the way of his men emptying a storehouse of its bolts of cloth. He saw Thomas and looked surprised, but he was too wary of Will Skeet to say anything. He just turned away. "Bastard must have paid off his debts by now," Skeet said, still staring at Sir Simon's back. "War's a good way to get rich, so long as you ain't taken prisoner and ransomed. Not that they'd ransom you or me, boy. Slit our bellies and prick our eyes out, more like." "Have you ever shot a crossbow?" "No. Ain't quite as easy as it looks. Not as hard as shooting a real bow, of course, but it still takes practice. Goddamn things can pitch a bit high if you're not used to them. Do Jake and Sam want to help you?" "They say so." "Of course they do, evil bastards that they are." Skeet still stared at Sir Simon, who was wearing his new, shining armor. "I reckon the bastard will carry his cash with him." "I would think so, yes." "Half mine, Tom, and I'll ask no questions come Saturday." "Thanks, Will." "But do it proper, Tom," Skeet said savagely. "Do it proper. I don't want to watch you hang. I don't mind watching most fools doing the rope dance with the piss running down their legs, but it'd be a shame to watch you twitching your way to the devil." They went back to the walls. Neither man had collected any plunder, but they had already taken more than enough from their raids on the North Breton farms, and it was now the turn of Toachsom's men to gorge themselves on a captured town. One by one the houses were searched and the tavern barrels were drained. Richard Toachsom wanted his force to leave Lannion at dawn, but there were too many captured carts waiting to get through the narrow eastern gate, and not nearly enough horses to pull the carts, so men were harnessing themselves to the shafts rather than leave their pickings behind. Other men were drunk and senseless, and Toachsom's men-at-arms scoured the town to find them. But it was fire that drove most of the drunks from their refuges. The townsfolk fled south as the English set the thatched roofs alight. The smoke thickened into a vast dirty pillar that drifted south on the small sea wind. The pillar glowed a lurid red on its underside, and it must have been that sight which first told the approaching force from Gangon that they had arrived too late to save the town. They had marched through the night, expecting to find some place where they could lay an ambush for Toachsom's men, but the damage was already done. Lannion was burning, and its wealth was piled on carts that were still being manhandled through the gate. But if the hated English could not be ambushed on their way to the town, then they could be surprised as they left, and so the enemy commanders swung their forces eastwards towards the road which led back to La Roche-Derrien. Cross-eyed Jake saw the enemy first. He was gazing south through the pearly mist that lay over the flat land, and he saw the shadows in the vapor. At first he thought it was a herd of cows. Then he decided it had to be refugees from the town. But then he saw a banner and a lance and the dull grey of a mail coat, and he shouted to Skeet that there were horsemen in sight. Skeet peered over the ramparts. "Can you see anything, Tom?" It was just before dawn proper, and the countryside was suffused with greyness and streaked with mist. Thomas stared. He could see a thick wood a mile or more to the south, and a low ridge showing dark above the mist. Then he saw the banners, and the grey mail in the grey light, and a thicket of lances. "Men-at-arms," he said. "A lot of the bastards." Skeet swore. Tochem's men were either still in the town, or else strung along the road to La Roche-de-Rien, and strung so far that there could be no hope of pulling them back behind Lagnon's walls. Though even if that had been possible, it was not practical, for the whole western side of the town was burning furiously, and the flames were spreading fast. To retreat behind the walls was to risk being roasted alive, but Tochem's men were hardly in a fit condition to fight. Many were drunk, and all were laden with plunder. "Hedgerow," Skeet said curtly, pointing to a ragged line of blackthorn and elder that ran parallel to the road, where the carts rumbled. "Archer to the hedge, Tom. We'll look after your horses. Christ knows how we'll stop the bastards." He made the sign of the cross, "but we ain't got much choice." Thomas bullied a passage at the crowded gate and led 40 archers across a soggy pasture to the hedgerow that seemed a flimsy barrier against the enemy massing in the silvery mist. There were at least 300 horsemen there. They were not advancing yet, but instead grouping themselves for a charge, and Thomas had only 40 men to stop them. "Spread out!" he shouted. "Spread out!" He briefly went onto one knee and made the sign of the cross. "Saint Sebastian," he prayed, "be with us now. Saint Guinevere, protect me." He touched the desiccated dog's paw, then made the sign of the cross again. A dozen more archers joined his force, but it was still far too small. A score of page boys, mounted on ponies and armed with toy swords, could have massacred the men on the road, for Thomas's hedge did not provide a complete screen, but rather straggled into nothingness about half a mile from the town. The horsemen only had to ride round that open end, and there would be nothing to stop them. Thomas could take his archers into the open ground, but 50 men could not stop 300. Archers were at their best when they were massed together, so that their arrows made a hard, steel-tipped rain. 50 men could make a shower, but they would still be overrun and massacred by the horsemen. "Crossbowmen," Jake grunted, and Thomas saw the men in green and red jackets emerging from the woods behind the enemy men-at-arms. The new dawn light reflected cold from mail, swords, and helmets. "Bastards are taking their time," Jake said nervously. He had planted a dozen arrows in the base of the hedge, which was just thick enough to stop the horsemen, but not nearly dense enough to slow a crossbow bolt. Will Skeet had gathered 60 of his men-at-arms beside the road, ready to countercharge the enemy, whose numbers increased every minute. Duke Charles's men and their French allies were riding eastwards now, looking to advance about the open end of the hedge, where there was an inviting swathe of green and open land leading all the way to the road. Thomas wondered why the hell they were waiting. He wondered if he would die here. Dear God, he thought, but there were not nearly enough men to stop this enemy. The fires continued to burn in Lannion, pouring smoke into the pale sky. He ran to the left of the line, where he found Father Hobb holding a bow. "You shouldn't be here, Father," he said. "God will forgive me," the priest said. He had tucked his cassock into his belt and had a small stand of arrows stuck into the hedge bank. Thomas gazed at the open land, wondering how long his men would last in that immensity of grass. Just what the enemy wanted, he thought, a stretch of bare, flat land on which their horses could run hard and straight. Only the land was not entirely flat, for it was dotted with grassy hummocks through which 2 grey herons walked stiff-legged as they hunted for frogs or ducklings. Frogs, Thomas thought, and ducklings. Sweet God, it was a marsh! The spring had been unusually dry, yet his boots were soaking from the damp field he had crossed to reach the hedgerow. The realization burst on Thomas like the rising sun. The open land was marsh. No wonder the enemy was waiting. They could see Tochsom's men strung out for slaughter, but they could see no way across the swampy ground. "This way!" Thomas shouted at the archers. "This way! Hurry! Hurry! Come on, you bastards!" He led them round the edge of the hedge into the swamp, where they leaped and splashed through a maze of marsh, tussocks, and streamlets. They went south, towards the enemy, and once in range, Thomas spread his men out and told them to indulge in target practice. His fear had gone, replaced by exultation. The enemy was balked by the marsh. Their horses could not advance, but Thomas's light archers could leap across the tussocks like demons, like Elka. "Kill the bastards!" he shouted. The white-fledged arrows hissed across the wetland to strike horses and men. Some of the enemy tried to charge the archers, but their horses floundered in the soft ground and became targets for volleys of arrows. The crossbowmen dismounted and advanced, but the archers switched their aim to them, and now more archers were arriving, dispatched by Skeet and Tochsom, so that the marsh was suddenly swarming with English and Welsh bowmen, who poured a steel-tipped hell on the befuddled enemy. It became a game. Men wagered on whether or not they could strike a particular target. The sun rose higher, casting shadows from the dead horses. The enemy was edging back to the trees. One brave group tried a last charge, hoping to skirt the marsh, but their horses stumbled in the soft ground, and the arrows spitted and sliced at them, so that men and beasts screamed as they fell. One horseman struggled on, flailing his beast with the flat of his sword. Thomas put an arrow into the horse's neck, and Jake skewered its haunch, and the animal screeched piteously as it thrashed in pain and collapsed into the swamp. The man somehow extricated his feet from his stirrups and stumbled, cursing towards the archers, with his sword held low and shield high. But Sam buried an arrow in his groin, and then a dozen more bowmen added their arrows before swarming over the fallen enemy. Knives were drawn, throats cut, then the business of plunder could begin. The corpses were stripped of their mail and weapons, and the horses of their bridles and saddles. Then Father Hob prayed over the dead while the archers counted their spoils. The enemy was gone by mid-morning. They left 200 of dead men, and twice that number had been wounded, but not a single Welsh or English archer had died. Duke Charles's men slunk back to Gangon. Lannion had been destroyed, they had been humiliated, and Will Skeet's men celebrated in La Roche-Derrien. They were the Helka, they were the best, and they could not be beaten. The following morning, Thomas, Sam, and Jake left La Roche-Derrien before daybreak. They rode west towards Lannion, but once in the woods they swerved off the road and picketed their horses deep among the trees. Then, moving like poachers, they worked their way back to the wood's edge. Each had his own bow slung on his shoulder, and carried a crossbow too, and they practiced with the unfamiliar weapons as they waited in a swathe of bluebells at the wood's margin, from where they could see La Roche-Derrien's western gate. Thomas had only brought a dozen bolts, short and stub-feathered, so each of them shot just 2 times. Will Skeet had been right. The weapons did kick up as the archers loosed, so that their first bolts went high on the trunk that was their target. Thomas's second shot was more accurate, but nothing like as true as an arrow shot from a proper bow. The near miss made him apprehensive of the morning's risks, but Jake and Sam were both cheerful at the prospect of larceny and murder. "Can't really miss," Sam said after his second shot had also gone high. "Might not catch the bastard in the belly, but we'll hit him somewhere." He levered the cord back, grunting with the effort. No man alive could haul a crossbow string by arm power alone, and so a mechanism had to be employed. The most expensive crossbows, those with the longest range, used a jack screw. The archer would place a cranked handle on the screw's end and wind the cord back, inch by creaking inch, until the pawl above the trigger engaged the string. Some crossbowmen used their bodies as a lever. They wore thick leather belts to which a hook was attached, and by bending down, attaching the hook to the cord and then straightening, they could pull the twisted strings back. But the crossbows Thomas had brought from Lannion used a lever, shaped like a goat's hind leg, that forced the cord and bent the short bow shaft, which was a layered thing of horn, wood, and glue. The lever was probably the fastest way of cocking the weapon, though it did not offer the power of a screw-cocked bow, and was still slow compared to a yew shaft. In truth, there was nothing to compare with the English bow, and Skeet's men debated endlessly why the enemy did not adopt the weapon. "Because they're daft," was Sam's curt judgment, though the truth, Thomas knew, was that other nations simply did not start their sons early enough. To be an archer meant starting as a boy, then practicing and practicing until the chest was broad, the arm muscles huge, and the arrow seemed to fly without the archer giving its aim any thought. Jake shot his second bolt into the oak and swore horribly when it missed the mark. He looked at the bow. "Piece of shit," he said. "How close are we going to be?" "Close as we can get," Thomas said. Jake sniffed. "If I can poke the bloody bow into the bastard's belly, I might not miss." 30, 40 feet should be all right, Sam reckoned. "Aim at his crotch," Thomas encouraged them, "and we should gut him." "It'll be all right," Jake said. "3 of us. One of us has got to skewer the bastard." "In the shadows, lads," Thomas said, gesturing them deeper into the trees. He had seen Jeanette coming from the gate, where the guards had inspected her pass, then waved her on. She sat sideways on a small horse that Will Skeet had lent her, and was accompanied by 2 grey-haired servants, a man and a woman, both of whom had grown old in her father's service, and now walked beside their mistress's horse. If Jeanette had truly planned to ride to Luanic, then such a feeble and aged escort would have been an invitation for trouble. But trouble, of course, was what she intended, and no sooner had she reached the trees than the trouble appeared, as Sir Simon Jekyll emerged from the archway's shadow, riding with 2 other men. "What if those 2 bastards stay close to him?" Sam asked. "They won't," Thomas said. He was certain of that, just as he and Jeanette had been certain that Sir Simon would follow her, and that he would wear the expensive suit of plate he had stolen from her. "She's a brave lass," Jake grunted. "She's got spirit," Thomas said. "Knows how to hate someone." Jake tested the point of a quarrel. "You and her?" he asked Thomas. "Doing it, are you?" "No, but you'd like to." "I would." "I don't know," Thomas said. He thought Jeanette beautiful, but Skeet was right. There was a hardness in her that repelled him. "I suppose so," he admitted. "Of course you would," Jake said. "Be daft not to." Once Jeanette was among the trees, Thomas and his companions trailed her, staying hidden and always conscious that Sir Simon and his 2 henchmen were closing quickly. Those 3 horsemen trotted once they reached the wood, and succeeded in catching up with Jeanette in a place that was almost perfect for Thomas's ambush. The road ran within yards of a clearing, where a meandering stream had undercut the roots of a willow. The fallen trunk was rotted and thick with disc-like fungi. Jeanette, pretending to make way for the 3 armored horsemen, turned into the clearing and waited beside the dead tree. Best of all, there was a stand of young alders close to the willow's trunk that offered cover to Thomas. Sir Simon turned off the road, ducked under the branches, and curbed his horse close to Jeanette. One of his companions was Henry Colley, the brutal yellow-haired man who had hurt Thomas so badly, while the other was Sir Simon's slack-jawed squire, who grinned in expectation of the coming entertainment. Sir Simon pulled off the snouted helmet and hung it on his saddle's pommel, then smiled triumphantly. "It is not safe, madame," he said, "to travel without an armed escort." "I am perfectly safe," Jeanette declared. Her 2 servants cowered beside her horse, as Colley and the squire hemmed Jeanette in place with their horses. Sir Simon dismounted with a clank of armor. "I had hoped, dear lady," he said, approaching her, "that we could talk on our way to Luanic." "You wish to pray to the Holy Eve?" Jeanette asked. "What will you beg of him? That he grants you courtesy?" "I would just talk with you, madame," Sir Simon said. "Talk of what?" "Of the complaint you made to the Earl of Northampton. You fouled my honor, lady." "Your honor?" Jeanette laughed. "What honor do you have that could be fouled? Do you even know the meaning of the word?" Thomas, hidden behind the straggle of alders, was whispering a translation to Jake and Sam. All 3 crossbows were cocked and had their wicked little bolts lying in the troughs. "If you will not talk to me on the road, madame, then we must have our conversation here," Sir Simon declared. "I have nothing to say to you." "Then you will find it easy enough to listen. he said, and reached up to haul her out of the saddle. She beat at his armored gauntlets, but no resistance of hers could prevent him from dragging her to the ground. The two servants shrieked protests, but Collie and the squire silenced them by grabbing their hair, then pulling them out of the clearing to leave Jeanette and Sir Simon alone. Jeanette had scrabbled backwards and was now standing beside the fallen tree. Thomas had raised his crossbow, but Jake pushed it down, for Sir Simon's escort was still too near. Sir Simon pushed Jeanette hard so that she sat down on the rotting trunk. Then he took a long dagger from his sword belt and drove its narrow blade hard through Jeanette's skirts so that she was pinned to the fallen willow. He hammered the knife hilt with his steel-shod foot to make sure it was deep in the trunk. Collie and the squire had vanished now, and the noise of their horses' hooves had faded among the leaves. Sir Simon smiled, then stepped forward and plucked the cloak from Jeanette's shoulders. "When I first saw you, my lady," he said, "I confess I thought of marriage. But you have been perverse, so I have changed my mind." He put his hands at her bodice's neckline and ripped it apart, tearing the laces from their embroidered holes. Jeanette screamed as she tried to cover herself, and Jake again held Thomas's arm down. "Wait till he gets the armor off," Jake whispered. They knew the bolts could pierce mail, but none of the three knew how strong the plate armor would prove. Sir Simon slapped Jeanette's hands away. "There, madame," he said, gazing at her breasts. "Now we can have discourse." Sir Simon stepped back and began to strip himself of the armor. He pulled off the plated gauntlets first, unbuckled the sword belt, then lifted the shoulder pieces on their leather harness over his head. He fumbled with the side buckles of the breast and back plates that were attached to a leather coat that also supported the rear braces and vambraces that protected his arms. The coat had a chain skirt, which, because of the weight of the plate and ring mail, made it a struggle for Sir Simon to drag over his head. He staggered as he pulled at the heavy armor, and Thomas again raised the crossbow, but Sir Simon was stepping back and forward as he tried to steady himself, and Thomas could not be sure of his aim, and so kept his finger off the trigger. The armor-laden coat thumped onto the ground, leaving Sir Simon tousle-haired and bare-chested, and Thomas again put the crossbow stock into his shoulder. But now Sir Simon sat down to strip off the cuisses, greaves, polaines, and boots, and he sat in such a way that his armored legs were towards the ambush and kept getting in the way of Thomas's aim. Jeanette was struggling with the knife, scared out of her wits that Thomas had not stayed close, but tug as she might, the dagger would not move. Sir Simon pulled off the solarets that covered his feet, then wriggled out of the leather breeches to which the leg plates were attached. "Now, madame," he said, standing whitely naked, "we can talk properly." Jeanette heaved a last time at the dagger, hoping to plunge it into Sir Simon's pale belly, and just then Thomas pulled his trigger. The bolt scraped across Sir Simon's chest. Thomas had aimed at the knight's groin, hoping to send the short arrow deep into his belly, but the bolt had grazed one of the whip-like alder boughs and been deflected. Blood streaked on Sir Simon's skin, and he dropped to the ground so fast that Jake's bolt whipped over his head. Sir Simon scrambled away, going first to his discarded armor. Then he realized he had no time to save the plate, and so he ran for his horse, and it was then that Sam's bolt caught him in the flesh of his right thigh, so that he yelped, half fell, and decided there was no time to rescue his horse either, and just limped naked and bleeding into the woods. Thomas loosed a second bolt that rattled past Sir Simon to whack into a tree, and then the naked man vanished. Thomas swore. He had meant to kill, but Sir Simon was all too alive. End of Side 7. Side 8. "I thought you weren't here," Jeanette said as Thomas appeared. She was clutching her torn clothing to her breasts. "We missed the bastard," Thomas said angrily. He heaved the dagger free of her skirts, while Jake and Sam thrust the armor into 2 sacks. Thomas threw down the crossbow and took his own black bow from his shoulder. What he should do now, he thought, was track Sir Simon through the trees and kill the bastard. He could pull out the white-feathered arrow and put a crossbow bolt into the wound, so that whoever found him would believe that bandits or the enemy had killed the knight. "Search the bastard's saddle pouches," he told Jake and Sam. Jeanette had tied the cloak round her neck, and her eyes widened as she saw the gold pour from the pouches.
"You're going to stay here with Jake and Sam," Thomas told her. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To finish the job," Thomas said grimly. He loosed the laces of his arrow bag and dropped one crossbow bolt in among the longer arrows. "Wait here," he told Jake and Sam. "I'll help you," Sam said. "No," Thomas insisted. "Wait here and look after the Countess." He was angry with himself. He should have used his own bow from the start and simply removed the telltale arrow and shot a bolt into Sir Simon's corpse, but he had fumbled the ambush. But at least Sir Simon had fled westwards, away from his 2 men-at-arms, and he was naked, bleeding, and unarmed. Easy prey, Thomas told himself, as he followed the blood drops among the trees. The trail went west, and then, as the blood thinned, southwards. Sir Simon was obviously working his way back towards his companions, and Thomas abandoned caution and just ran, hoping to cut the fugitive off. Then, bursting through some hazels, he saw Sir Simon, limping and bent. Thomas pulled the bow back, and just then Colley and the squire came into view, both with swords drawn and both spurring their horses at Thomas. He switched his aim to the nearest and loosed without thinking. He loosed as a good archer should, and the arrow went true and fast, smack into the mailed chest of the squire, who was thrown back in his saddle. His sword dropped to the ground as his horse swerved hard to its left, going in front of Sir Simon. Colley wrenched his reins and reached for Sir Simon, who clutched at his outstretched hand, and then half ran and was half carried away into the trees. Thomas had dragged a second arrow from the bag, but by the time he loosed it, the 2 men were half hidden by trees, and the arrow glanced off a branch and was lost among the leaves. Thomas swore. Colley had stared straight at Thomas for an instant. Sir Simon had also seen him, and Thomas, a third arrow on his string, just stared at the trees as he understood that everything had just fallen apart. In one instant, everything. He ran back to the clearing by the stream. "You're to take the Countess to the town," he told Jake and Sam, "but for Christ's sake, go carefully. They'll be searching for us soon. You'll have to sneak back." They stared at him, not understanding, and Thomas told them what had happened. How he had killed Sir Simon's squire, and how that made him both a murderer and a fugitive. He had been seen by Sir Simon and by the yellow-haired Colley, and they would both be witnesses at his trial and celebrants at his execution. He told Jeanette the same in French. "You can trust Jake and Sam," he told her, "but you mustn't be caught going home. You have to go carefully." Jake and Sam argued, but Thomas knew well enough what the consequences of the killing arrow were. "Tell Will what happened," he told them. "Blame it all on me, and say I'll wait for him at Quatre-Vents." That was a village the Elka had laid waste south of La Roche-Derrien. "Tell him I'd like his advice." Jeanette tried to persuade him that his panic was unnecessary. "Perhaps they did not recognize you," she suggested. "They recognize me, my lady," Thomas said grimly. He smiled ruefully. "I am sorry, but at least you have your armor and sword. Hide them well." He pulled himself into Sir Simon's saddle. "Quatre-Vents," he told Jake and Sam, then spurred southwards through the trees. He was a murderer, a wanted man and a fugitive, and that meant he was any man's prey, alone in the wilderness made by the Elka. He had no idea what he should do or where he could go, only that if he was to survive, then he must ride like the devil's horseman that he was. So he did. Quatre-Vents had been a small village, scarce larger than Hookton, with a gaunt, barn-like church, a cluster of cottages where cows and people had shared the same thatched roofs, a watermill, and some outlying farms crouched in sheltered valleys. Only the stone walls of the church and mill were left now. The rest was just ashes, dust, and weeds. The blossom was blowing from the untended orchards when Thomas arrived on a horse sweated white by its long journey. He released the stallion to graze in a well-hedged and overgrown pasture, then took himself into the woods above the church. He was shaken, nervous, and frightened, for what had seemed like a game had twisted his life into darkness. Not a few hours before, he had been an archer in England's army, and, though his future might not have appealed to the young men with whom he had rioted in Oxford, Thomas had been certain he would at least rise as high as Will Skeet. He had imagined himself leading a band of soldiers, becoming wealthy, following his black bow to fortune and even rank. But now he was a hunted man. He was in such panic that he began to doubt Will Skeet's reaction, fearing that Skeet would be so disgusted at the failure of the ambush that he would arrest Thomas and lead him back to a rope-dancing end in La Roche-Derrien's marketplace. He worried that Jeanette would have been caught going back to the town. Would they charge her with murder too? He shivered as night fell. He was 22 years old, he had failed utterly, he was alone and he was lost. He woke in a cold, drizzling dawn. Hares raced across the pasture where Sir Simon Jekyll's destrier cropped the grass. Thomas opened the purse he kept under his mail coat and counted his coins. There was the gold from Sir Simon's saddle pouch and his own few coins, so he was not poor. But like most of the Elquin, he left the bulk of his money in Will Skeet's keeping. Even when they were out raiding, there were always some men left in La Roche-Derrien to keep an eye on the horde. What would he do? He had a bow and some arrows, and perhaps he could walk to Gascony, though he had no idea how far that was. But at least he knew there were English garrisons there, who would surely welcome another trained archer. Or perhaps he could find a way to cross the channel, go home, find another name, start again. Except he had no home. What he must never do was find himself within a hanging rope's distance of Sir Simon Jekyll. The Elquin arrived shortly after midday. The archers rode into the village first, followed by the men-at-arms, who were escorting a one-horse wagon that had wooden hoops supporting a flapping cover of brown cloth. Father Hobb and Will Skeet rode beside the wagon, which puzzled Thomas, for he had never known the Elquin use such a vehicle before. But then Skeet and the priest broke away from the men-at-arms and spurred their horses towards the field where the stallion grazed. The two men stopped by the hedge, and Skeet cupped his hands and shouted towards the woods, "Come on out, you daft bastard!" Thomas emerged, very sheepishly, to be greeted with an ironic cheer from the archers. Skeet regarded him sourly. "God's bones, Tom," he said, "but the devil did a bad thing when he humped your mother." Father Hobb tutted at Will's blasphemy, then raised a hand in blessing. "You missed a fine sight, Tom," he said cheerfully. "Sir Simon coming home to La Roche, half naked and bleeding like a stuck pig. I'll hear your confession before we go." "Don't grin, you stupid bastard," Skeet snapped. "Sweet Christ, Tom, but if you do a job, do it proper. Do it proper. Why did you leave the bastard alive?" "I missed." "Then you go and kill some poor bastard squire instead. Sweet Christ, but you're a goddamn bloody fool." "I suppose they want to hang me?" Thomas asked.
"Oh, no," Skeet said in feigned surprise. "Of course not. They want to feast you, hang garlands round your neck, and give you a dozen virgins to warm your bed. What the hell do you think they want to do with you? Of course they want you dead, and I swore on my mother's life I'd bring you back if I found you alive."
"Does he look alive to you, Father?"
Father Hobb examined Thomas.
"He looks very dead to me, Master Skeet."
"He bloody deserves to be dead, the daft bastard."
"Did the Countess get safe home?" Thomas asked.
"She got home, if that's what you mean," Skeet said. "But what do you think Sir Simon wanted the moment he'd covered up his shriveled prick? To have her house searched, Tom, for some armor and a sword that were legitimately his. He's not such a daft fool. He knows you and she were together." Thomas cursed, and Skeet repeated the blasphemy. "So they pressed her two servants, and they admitted the Countess planned everything."
"They did what?"
Thomas asked. "They pressed them," Skeet repeated, which meant that the old couple had been put flat on the ground and had stones piled on their chests. "The old girl squealed everything at the first stone, so they were hardly hurt," Skeet went on. "And now Sir Simon wants to charge her ladyship with murder. And naturally had her house searched for the sword and armour, but they found nought, because I had them and her hidden well away. But she's still as deep in the shit as you are. You can't just go about sticking crossbow bolts into knights and slaughtering squires, Tom. It upsets the order of things."
"I'm sorry, Will," Thomas said.
"So the long and the brief of it," Skeet said, "is that the Countess is seeking the protection of her husband's uncle." He jerked a thumb at the cart. "She's in that, together with her bairn, two bruised servants, a suit of armour, and a sword."
"Sweet Jesus," Thomas said, staring at the cart.
"You put her there," Skeet growled, "not him.
and I had the devil's own business keeping her hid from Sir Simon. Dick Toachum suspects I'm up to no good, and he don't approve, though he took my word in the end, but I still had to promise to drag you back by the scruff of your miserable neck. But I haven't seen you, Tom." "I'm sorry, Will," Thomas said again. "You bloody well should be sorry," Skeet said, though he was exuding a quiet satisfaction that he had managed to clean up Thomas's mess so efficiently. Jake and Sam had not been seen by Sir Simon or his surviving man-at-arms, so they were safe. Thomas was a fugitive, and Jeanette had been safely smuggled out of La Roche-Derrien before Sir Simon could make her life into utter misery. "She's travelling to Gangum," Skeet went on, "and I'm sending a dozen men to escort her, and God only knows if the enemy will respect their flag of truce. If I had a lick of bloody sense, I'd skin you alive and make a bow cover out of your hide." "Yes, Will," Thomas said meekly. "Don't bloody yes will me," Skeet said. "What are you going to do with the few days you've got left to live?" "I don't know." Skeet sniffed. "You could grow up for a start, though there's probably scant chance of that happening." "Right, lad." He braced himself, taking charge. "I took your money from the chest, so here it is." He handed Thomas a leather pouch. "And I've put 3 sheaves of arrows in the lady's cart, and that'll keep you for a few days. If you've got any sense, which you ain't, then you go south or north. You could go to Gascony, but it's a hell of a long walk. Flanders is closer and has plenty of English troops, who'll probably take you in if they're desperate. That's my advice, lad. Go north, and hope Sir Simon never goes to Flanders." "Thank you," Thomas said. "But how do you get to Flanders?" Skeet asked. "Walk," Thomas suggested. "God's bones," Will said, "but you're a useless, worm-eaten piece of lousy meat. Walk dressed like that and carrying a bow, and you might just as well just cut your own throat. It'll be quicker than letting the French do it." "You might find this useful," Father Hobb intervened, and offered Thomas a black cloth bundle, which on unrolling proved to be the robe of a Dominican friar. "You speak Latin, Tom," the priest said, "so you could pass for a wandering preacher. If anyone challenges you, say you're traveling from Avignon to Aachen." Thomas thanked him. "Do many Dominicans travel with a bow?" he asked. "Lad," Father Hobbs said sadly, "I can unbutton your breeches, and I could point you downwind, but even with the good Lord's help, I can't piss for you." "In other words," Skeet said, "work it out for yourself. You got yourself in this bloody mess, Tom, so you get yourself out. I enjoyed your company, lad. Thought you'd be useless when I first saw you, and you weren't, but you are now. But be lucky, boy." He held out his hand, and Thomas shook it. "You might as well go to Gangam with the Countess," Skeet finished, "and then find your own way. But Father Hobb wants to save your soul first. God knows why." Father Hobb dismounted and led Thomas into the roofless church, where grass and weeds now grew between the flagstones. He insisted on hearing a confession, and Thomas was feeling abject enough to sound contrite. Father Hobb sighed when it was done. "You killed a man, Tom," he said heavily, "and it is a great sin." "Father," Thomas began. No, Tom, no excuses. The Church says that to kill in battle is a duty a man owes to his Lord, but you killed outside the law. That poor squire, what offense did he give you? And he had a mother, Tom. Think of her. No, you've sinned grievously, and I must give you a grievous penance." Thomas, on his knees, looked up to see a buzzard sliding between the thinning clouds above the church's scorched walls. Then Father Hobb stepped closer, looming above him. "I'll not have you muttering Pater Nosters, Tom," the priest said, "but something hard, something very hard." He put his hand on Thomas's hair. "Your penance is to keep the promise you made to your father." He paused to hear Thomas's response, but the young man was silent. "You hear me?" Father Hobb demanded fiercely. "Yes, Father." "You will find the lance of St. George, Thomas, and return it to England. That is your penance. And now," he changed into execrable Latin,
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, I absolve you." He made the sign of the cross. "Don't waste your life, Tom." "I think I already have, Father. You're just young. It seems like that when you're young. Life's nothing but joy or misery when you're young." He helped Thomas up from his knees. "You're not hanging from a gibbet, are you? You're alive, Tom, and there's a deal of life in you yet." He smiled. "I have a feeling we shall meet again." Thomas made his farewells, then watched as Will Skeet collected Sir Simon Jekyll's horse and led the Elkin eastwards, leaving the wagon and its small escort in the ruined village. The leader of the escort was called Hugh Boltby, one of Skeet's better men-at-arms, and he reckoned they would likely meet the enemy the next day, somewhere close to Gangon. He would hand the Countess over, then ride back to join Skeet. "And you'd best not be dressed as an archer, Tom," he added. Thomas walked beside the wagon that was driven by Pierre, the old man who had been pressed by Sir Simon. Jeanette did not invite Thomas inside. Indeed, she pretended he did not exist. The next morning, after they had camped in an abandoned farm, she laughed at the sight of him dressed in the friar's robe. "I'm sorry about what happened," Thomas said to her. Jeanette shrugged. "It may be for the best. I probably should have gone to Duke Charles last winter." "Why didn't you, my lady?" "He hasn't always been kind to me," she said wistfully, "but I think that might have changed by now." She had persuaded herself that the Duke's attitude might have altered because of the letters she had sent to him, letters that would help him when he led his troops against the garrison at La Roche-Derrien. She also needed to believe the Duke would welcome her, for she desperately needed a safe home for her son, Charles, who was enjoying the adventure of riding in a swaying, creaking wagon. Together they would both start a new life in Gangon, and Jeanette had woken with optimism about that new life. She had been forced to leave La Roche-Derrien in a frantic hurry, putting into the cart just the retrieved armor, the sword, and some clothes, though she had some money that Thomas suspected Will had given to her. But her real hopes were pinned on Duke Charles, who, she told Thomas, would surely find her a house and lend her money in advance of the missing rents from Plabennec. "He is sure to like Charles, don't you think?" she asked Thomas. "I'm sure," Thomas said, glancing at Jeanette's son, who was shaking the wagon's reins and clicking his tongue in a vain effort to make the horse go quicker. "But what will you do?" Jeanette asked. "I'll survive," Thomas said, unwilling to admit that he did not know what he would do. "Go to Flanders, probably, if he could ever reach there. Join another troop of archers, and pray nightly that Sir Simon Jekyll never came his way again." As for his penance, the lance, he had no idea how he was to find it or, having found it, retrieve it. Jeanette, on that second day of the journey, decided Thomas was a friend after all. "When we get to Gangon," she told him, "you find somewhere to stay, and I shall persuade the Duke to give you a pass. Even a wandering friar will be helped by a pass from the Duke of Brittany." But no friar ever carried a bow, let alone a long English war bow, and Thomas did not know what to do with the weapon. He was loath to abandon it, but the sight of some charred timbers in the abandoned farmhouse gave him an idea. He broke off a short length of blackened timber and lashed it crosswise to the unstrung bowstave so that it resembled a pilgrim's cross-staff. He remembered a Dominican visiting Hookton with just such a staff. The friar, his hair cropped so short he looked bald, had preached a fiery sermon outside the church until Thomas's father became tired of his ranting and sent him on his way. And Thomas now reckoned he would have to pose as just such a man. Jeanette suggested he tied flowers to the staff to disguise it further, and so he wrapped it with clovers that grew tall and ragged in the abandoned fields. The wagon, hauled by a bony horse that had been plundered from Lannion, lurched and lumbered southwards. The men-at-arms became ever more cautious as they neared Gangon, fearing an ambush of crossbow bolts from the woods that pressed close to the deserted road. One of the men had a hunting horn that he sounded constantly to warn the enemy of their approach and to signal that they came in peace, while Boltby had a strip of white cloth hanging from the tip of his lance. There was no ambush, but a few miles short of Gangon, they came in sight of a ford where a band of enemy soldiers waited. 2 men-at-arms and a dozen crossbowmen ran forward, their weapons cocked,
and Boltby summoned Thomas from the wagon. "Talk to them," he ordered. Thomas was nervous. "What do I say?" "Give them a bloody blessing, for Christ's sake," Boltby said, disgusted, "and tell them we're here in peace." So, with a beating heart and a dry mouth, Thomas walked down the road. The black gown flapped awkwardly about his ankles as he waved his hands at the crossbowmen. "Lower your weapons," he called in French. "Lower your weapons. The Englishmen come in peace." One of the horsemen spurred forward. His shield bore the same white ermine badge that Duke John's men carried, though these supporters of Duke Charles had surrounded the ermine with a blue wreath on which fleur-de-lis had been painted. "Who are you, father?" the horseman demanded. Thomas opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He gaped up at the horseman, who had a reddish moustache and oddly yellow eyes. A hard-looking bastard, Thomas thought, and he raised a hand to touch St. Guinefort's paw. Perhaps the saint inspired him, for he was suddenly possessed of devilment and began to enjoy playing a priest's role. "I am merely one of God's humbler children, my son," he answered unctuously. "Are you English?" the man-at-arms demanded suspiciously. Thomas's French was near perfect, but it was the French spoken by England's rulers rather than the language of France itself. Thomas again felt panic fluttering in his breast, but he bought time by making the sign of the cross, and as his hand moved, so inspiration came to him. "I am a Scotsman, my son," he said, and that allayed the yellow-eyed man's suspicions. The Scots had ever been France's ally. Thomas knew nothing of Scotland, but doubted many Frenchmen or Bretons did either, for it was far away and by all accounts a most uninviting place. Skeet always said it was a country of bog, rock, and heathen bastards who were twice as difficult to kill as any Frenchman. "I am a Scotsman," Thomas repeated, "who brings a kinswoman of the Duke out of the hands of the English." The man-at-arms glanced at the wagon. "A kinswoman of Duke Charles? Is there another Duke?" Thomas asked innocently. "She is the Countess of Armorica," he went on, "and her son, who is with her, is the Duke's grandnephew and a count in his own right. The English have held them prisoner these 6 months, but by God's good grace they have relented and set her free. The Duke, I know, will want to welcome her." Thomas laid on Jeanette's rank and relationship to the Duke as thick as newly skimmed cream, and the enemy swallowed it whole. They allowed the wagon to continue, and Thomas watched as Hugh Boltby led his men away at a swift trot, eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the crossbowmen. The leader of the enemy's men-at-arms talked with Jeanette, and seemed impressed by her hauteur. He would, he said, be honored to escort the Countess to Guingamp, though he warned her that the Duke was not there, but was still returning from Paris. He was said to be at Rennes now, a city that lay a good day's journey to the east. "You will take me as far as Rennes?" Jeanette asked Thomas. "You want me to, my lady?" "A young man is useful," she said. "Pierre is old," she gestured at the servant, "and has lost his strength. Besides, if you are going to Flanders, then you will need to cross the river at Rennes." So Thomas kept her company for the 3 days that it took the painfully slow wagon to make the journey. They needed no escort beyond Guingamp, for there was small danger of any English raiders this far east in Brittany, and the road was well patrolled by the Duke's forces. The countryside looked strange to Thomas, for he had become accustomed to rank fields, untended orchards, and deserted villages, but here the farms were busy and prosperous. The churches were bigger and had stained glass, and fewer folk spoke Breton. This was still Brittany, but the language was French. They stayed in country taverns that had fleas in the straw. Jeanette and her son were given what passed for the best room, while Thomas shared the stables with the 2 servants. They met 2 priests on the road, but neither suspected that Thomas was an impostor. He greeted them in Latin, which he spoke better than they did, and both men wished him a good day and a fervent Godspeed. Thomas could almost feel their relief when he did not engage them in further conversation. The Dominicans were not popular with parish priests. The friars were priests themselves, but were charged with the suppression of heresy, so a visitation by the Dominicans suggested that a parish priest had not been doing his duty, and even a rough, wild, and young friar like Thomas was unwelcome. They reached Rennes in the afternoon. There were dark clouds in the east, against which the city loomed, larger than any place Thomas had ever seen. The walls were twice as high as those at Lannion or La Roche-Derrien, and had towers with pointed roofs every few yards to serve as buttresses from which crossbowmen could pour bolts on any attacking force. Above the walls, higher even than the turrets, the church towers, or the cathedral, was the citadel, a stronghold of pale stone hung with banners. The smell of the city wafted westwards on a chill wind, a stink of sewage, tanneries, and smoke. The guards at the western gate became excited when they discovered the arrows in the wagon, but Jeanette persuaded them that they were trophies she was taking to the Duke. Then they wanted to levy a customs duty on the fine armor, and Jeanette harangued them again, using her title and the Duke's name liberally. The soldiers eventually gave in and allowed the wagon into the narrow streets, where shop wares protruded onto the roadway. Beggars ran beside the wagon, and soldiers jostled Thomas, who was leading the horse. The city was crammed with soldiers. Most of the men-at-arms were wearing the wreathed white ermine badge, but many had the green Grail of Genoa on their tunics, and the presence of so many troops confirmed that the Duke was indeed in the city, and readying himself for the campaign that would eject the English from Brittany. They found a tavern beneath the cathedral's looming twin towers. Jeanette wanted to ready herself for her audience with the Duke, and demanded a private room, though all she got for her cash was a spider-haunted space beneath the tavern's eaves. The innkeeper, a sallow fellow with a twitch, suggested Thomas would be happier in the Dominican friary that lay by the church of Saint-Germain, north of the cathedral. But Thomas declared his mission was to be among sinners, not saints, and so the innkeeper grudgingly said he could sleep in Jeanette's wagon that was parked in the inn yard. "But no preaching, Father," the man added. "No preaching. There's enough of that in the city without spoiling the 3 keys." Jeanette's maid brushed her mistress's hair, then coiled and pinned the black tresses into ram's horns that covered her ears. Jeanette put on a red velvet dress that had escaped the sack of her house, and which had a skirt that fell from just beneath her breasts to the floor, while the bodice, intricately embroidered with cornflowers and daisies, hooked tight up to her neck. Its sleeves were full, trimmed with fox fur, and dropped to her red shoes, which had horn buckles. Her hat matched the dress and was trimmed with the same fur and a blue-black veil of lace. She spat on her son's face and rubbed off the dirt, then led him down to the tavern yard. "Do you think the veil is right?" she asked Thomas anxiously. Thomas shrugged. "It looks right to me." "No, the color. Is it right with the red?" He nodded, hiding his astonishment. He had never seen her dressed so fashionably. She looked like a countess now, while her son was in a clean smock and had his hair wetted and smoothed. "You're to meet your great-uncle," Jeanette told Charles, licking a finger and rubbing at some more dirt on his cheek. "And he's nephew to the King of France, which means you're related to the king." "Yes, you are. Aren't you a lucky boy?" Charles recoiled from his mother's fussing, but she did not notice, for she was busy instructing Pierre, her manservant, to stow the armor and sword in a great sack. She wanted the Duke to see the armor. "I want him to know," she told Thomas, "that when my son comes of age, he will fight for him." Pierre, who claimed to be 70 years old, lifted the sack and almost fell over with the weight. Thomas offered to carry it to the citadel instead, but Jeanette would not hear of it. "You might pass for a Scotsman among the common folk, but the Duke's entourage will have men who may have visited the place." She smoothed wrinkles from the red velvet skirt. "You wait here," she told Thomas, "and I'll send Pierre back with a message, maybe even some money. I'm sure the Duke is going to be generous. I shall demand a pass for you. What name shall I use? A Scots name? Just Thomas the Friar?" "As soon as he sees you," she was now talking to her son, "he'll open his purse, won't he?" "Of course he will." Pierre managed to hoist the armor onto his shoulder without falling over, and Jeanette took her son's hand. "I shall send you a message," she promised Thomas. "God's blessing, my child," Thomas said, "and may the blessed St. Guinevere watch over you." Jeanette wrinkled her nose at that mention of St. Guinevere, who she had learned from Thomas was really a dog. "I shall put my trust in Saint Renan. she said reprovingly, and with those words she left. Pierre and his wife followed her, and Thomas waited in the yard, offering blessings to ostlers, stray cats, and tapmen. Be mad enough, his father had once said, and they will either lock you away or make you a saint. The night fell, damp and cold, with a gusting wind sighing in the cathedral's towers and rustling the tavern's thatch. Thomas thought of the penance that Father Hobb had demanded. Was the lance real? Had it truly smashed through a dragon's scales, pierced the ribs, and riven a heart in which cold blood flowed? He thought it was real. His father had believed, and his father, though he might have been mad, had been no fool. And the lance had looked old, so very old. Thomas had used to pray to St. George, but he no longer did, and that made him feel guilty, so that he dropped to his knees beside the wagon and asked the saint to forgive him his sins, to forgive him for the squire's murder, and for impersonating a friar. I do not mean to be a bad person, he told the dragon killer, but it is so easy to forget heaven and the saints. And if you wish, he prayed, I will find the lance, but you must tell me what to do with it. Should he restore it to Hookton, that, so far as Thomas knew, no longer existed? Or should he return it to whoever had owned it before his grandfather stole it? And who was his grandfather? And why had his father hidden from his family? And why had the family sought him out to take the lance back? Thomas did not know, and for the past 3 years he had not cared. But suddenly, in the tavern yard, he found himself consumed by curiosity. He did have a family somewhere. His grandfather had been a soldier and a thief. But who was he? He added a prayer to St. George to allow him to discover them. "Praying for rain, Father?" one of the ostlers suggested. "I reckon we're going to get it. We need it." Thomas could have eaten in the tavern, but he was suddenly nervous of the crowded room where the Duke's soldiers and their women sang, boasted, and brawled. Nor could he face the landlord's sly suspicions. The man was curious why Thomas did not go to the friary, and even more curious why a friar should travel with a beautiful woman. "She is my cousin," Thomas had told the man, who had pretended to believe the lie. But Thomas had no desire to face more questions, and so he stayed in the yard and made a poor meal from the dry bread, sour onions, and hard cheese that was the only food left in the wagon. It began to rain, and he retreated into the wagon and listened to the drops patter on the canvas cover. He thought of Jeanette and her little son being fed sugared delicacies on silver plates before sleeping between clean linen sheets in some tapestry-hung bedchamber, and then began to feel sorry for himself. He was a fugitive. Jeanette was his only ally, and she was too high and mighty for him. Bells announced the shutting of the city's gates. Watchmen walked the streets, looking for fires that could destroy a city in a few hours. Sentries shivered on the walls, and Duke Charles's banners flew from the citadel's summit. Thomas was among his enemies, protected by nothing more than wit and a Dominican's robe. And he was alone. Jeanette became increasingly nervous as she approached the citadel, but she had persuaded herself that Charles of Blois would accept her as a dependent once he met her son, who was named for him, and Jeanette's husband had always said that the Duke would like Jeanette if only he could get to know her better. It was true that the Duke had been cold in the past, but her letters must have convinced him of her allegiance, and at the very least she was certain he would possess the chivalry to look after a woman in distress. To her surprise, it was easier to enter the citadel than it had been to negotiate the city gate. The sentries waved her across the drawbridge, beneath the arch, and so into a great courtyard ringed with stables, mews, and storehouses. A score of men-at-arms were practicing with their swords, which, in the gloom of the late afternoon, generated bright sparks. More sparks flowed from a smithy where a horse was being shoed, and Jeanette caught the whiff of burning hoof, mingling with the stink of a dung-heap and the reek of a decomposing corpse which hung in chains high on the courtyard wall. A laconic and misspelled placard pronounced the man to have been a thief. A steward guided her through a second arch, and so into a great cold chamber where a score of petitioners waited to see the Duke. A clerk took her name, raising an eyebrow in silent surprise when she announced herself. "His Grace will be told of your presence," the man said in a bored voice, then dismissed Jeanette to a stone bench that ran along one of the hall's high walls. Pierre lowered the armor to the floor and squatted beside it, while Jeanette sat. Some of the petitioners paced up and down, clutching scrolls and silently mouthing the words they would use when they saw the Duke, while others complained to the clerks that they had already been waiting 3, 4, or even 5 days. How much longer? A dog lifted its leg against the pillar. Then 2 small boys, 6 or 7 years old, ran into the hall with mock wooden swords. They gazed at the petitioners for a second, then ran up some stairs that were guarded by men-at-arms. Were they the Duke's sons? Jeanette wondered, and she imagined Charles making friends with the boys. "You're going to be happy here," she told him. "I'm hungry, Mama. We shall eat soon." She waited. 2 women strolled along the gallery at the head of the stairs, wearing pale dresses made of expensive linen that seemed to float as they walked, and Jeanette suddenly felt shabby in her wrinkled red velvet. "You must be polite to the Duke," she told Charles, who was getting fretful from hunger. "You kneel to him. Can you do that? Show me how you kneel." "I want to go home," Charles said. "Just for Mama. Show me how you kneel." "That's good." Jeanette ruffled her son's hair in praise, then immediately tried to stroke it back into place. From upstairs came the sound of a sweet harp and a breathy flute, and Jeanette thought longingly of the life she wanted, a life fit for a countess, edged with music and handsome men, elegance and power. She would rebuild Plabennec, though with what she did not know, but she would make the tower larger and have a staircase like the one in this hall. An hour passed, then another. It was dark now, and the hall was dimly lit by 2 burning torches that sent smoke into the fan tracery of the high roof. Charles became even more petulant, so Jeanette took him in her arms and tried to rock him to sleep. 2 priests, arm in arm, came slowly down the stairs, laughing, and then a servant in the Duke's livery ran down, and all the petitioners straightened and looked at the man expectantly. He crossed to the clerk's table, spoke there for a moment, then turned and bowed to Jeanette. She stood. "You will wait here," she told her 2 servants. The other petitioners stared at her resentfully. She had been the last to enter the hall, yet she was the first to be summoned. Charles dragged his feet, and Jeanette struck him lightly on the head to remind him of his manners. The servant walked silently beside her. "His Grace is in good health?" Jeanette asked nervously. The servant did not reply, just led her up the stairs, then turned right down the gallery, where rain spat through open windows. They went under an arch and up a further flight of steps, at the top of which the servant threw open a high door. "The Count of Armorica," he announced, "and his mother." The room was evidently in one of the citadel's turrets, for it was circular. A great fireplace was built into one side, while cruciform arrow slits opened onto the grey wet darkness beyond the walls. The circular chamber itself was brilliantly lit by 40 or 50 candles that cast their light over hanging tapestries, a great polished table, a chair, a prie-dieu carved with scenes from Christ's Passion, and a fur-covered couch. The floor was soft with deerskins. 2 clerks worked at a smaller table, while the Duke, gorgeous in a deep blue robe edged with ermine and with a cap to match, sat at the great table. A middle-aged priest, gaunt, white-haired and narrow-faced, stood beside the prie-dieu and watched Jeanette with an expression of distaste. Jeanette curtsied to the Duke and nudged Charles. "Kneel," she whispered. Charles began crying and hid his face in his mother's skirts. The Duke flinched at the child's noise, but said nothing. He was still young, though closer to 30 than to 20, and had a pale, watchful face. He was thin, had a fair beard and moustache, and long, bony white hands that were clasped in front of his downturned mouth. His reputation was that of a learned and pious man, but there was a petulance in his expression that made Jeanette wary. She wished he would speak, but all 4 men in the room just watched her in silence. I have the honor of presenting your Grace's grand-nephew, Jeanette said, pushing her crying son forward. The Count of Armorica. The Duke looked at the boy. His face betrayed nothing. He is named Charles, Jeanette said, but she might as well have stayed silent, for the Duke still said nothing. The silence was broken only by the child's whimpering and the crackle of flames in the great hearth. I trust your Grace received my letters, Jeanette said nervously. The priest suddenly spoke, making Jeanette jump with surprise. You came here, he said in a high voice, with a servant carrying a burden. What is in it? Jeanette realized they must have thought she had brought the Duke a gift, and she blushed, for she had not thought to bring one. Even a small token would have been a tactful gesture, but she had simply not remembered that courtesy. It contains my dead husband's armor and sword, she said, which I rescued from the English, who have otherwise left me with nothing. Nothing. I am keeping the armor and sword for my son, so that one day he can use them to fight for his liege lord. She bowed her head to the Duke. The Duke steepled his fingers. To Jeanette it seemed he never blinked, and that was as unsettling as his silence. His Grace would like to see the armor, the priest announced, though the Duke had shown no sign of wishing anything at all. The priest snapped his fingers, and one of the clerks left the room. The second clerk, armed with a small pair of scissors, went round the big chamber, trimming the wicks of the many candles in their tall iron holders. The Duke and the priest ignored him. You say, the priest spoke again, that you wrote letters to his Grace, concerning what? I wrote about the new defences at La Roche-Derrien, Father, and I warned his Grace of the English attack on Lannion. So you say, the priest said. So you say. Charles was still crying, and Jeanette jerked his hand hard in the hope of stilling him, but he just whined more. The clerk, head averted from the Duke, went from candle to candle. The scissors snipped, a puff of smoke would writhe for a heartbeat, then the flame would brighten and settle. Charles began crying louder. His Grace, the priest said, does not like snivelling infants. He is hungry, Father, Jeanette explained nervously. You came with 2 servants? Yes, Father, Jeanette said. They can eat with the boy in the kitchens, the priest said, and snapped his fingers towards the candle-trimming clerk who, abandoning his scissors on a rug, took the frightened Charles by the hand. The boy did not want to leave his mother, but he was dragged away, and Jeanette flinched as the sound of his crying receded down the stairs. End of Side 8. Side 9. The Duke, other than steepling his fingers, had not moved. He just watched Jeanette with an unreadable expression. You say, the priest took up the questioning again, that the English left you with nothing. They stole all I had. The priest flinched at the passion in her voice. If they left you destitute, madame, then why did you not come for our help earlier? I did not wish to be a burden, Father. But now you do wish to become a burden. Jeanette frowned. I have brought his Grace's nephew, the Lord of Clabenec. Or would you rather that he grew up among the English? Do not be impertinent, child, the priest said placidly. The first clerk re-entered the room carrying the sack, which he emptied on the deerskins in front of the Duke's table. The Duke gazed at the armor for a few seconds, then settled back in his high carved chair. It is very fine, the priest declared. It is most precious, Jeanette agreed. The Duke peered again at the armor. Not a muscle of his face moved. His Grace approves, the priest said, then gestured with a long white hand, and the clerk, who seemed to understand what was wanted without words, gathered up the sword and armor and carried them from the room. I am glad your Grace approves, Jeanette said, and dropped another curtsy. She had a confused idea that the Duke, despite her earlier words, had assumed the armor and sword were a gift, but she did not want to inquire. It could all be cleared up later. A gust of cold wind came through the arrow slits to bring spots of rain and to flicker the candles in wild shudders. So what, the priest asked, do you require of us? My son needs shelter, Father, Jeanette said nervously. He needs a house, a place to grow and learn to be a warrior. His Grace is pleased to grant that request, the priest said. Jeanette felt a great wash of relief. The atmosphere in the room was so unfriendly that she had feared she would be thrown out as destitute as she had arrived. But the priest's words, though coldly stated, told her that she need not have worried. The Duke was taking his responsibility, and she curtsied for a third time. "I am grateful, Your Grace." The priest was about to respond, but to Jeanette's surprise, the Duke held up one long white hand, and the priest bowed. "It is our pleasure," the Duke said in an oddly high-pitched voice, "for your son is dear to us, and it is our desire that he grows to become a warrior like his father." He turned to the priest and inclined his head, and the priest gave another stately bow, then left the room. The Duke stood and walked to the fire, where he held his hands to the small flames. "It has come to our notice," he said distantly, "that the rents of Plabennec have not been paid these 12 quarters. The English are in possession of the domain, Your Grace. And you are in debt to me," the Duke said, frowning at the flames. "If you protect my son, Your Grace, then I shall be forever in your debt," Jeanette said humbly. The Duke took off his cap and ran a hand through his fair hair. Jeanette thought he looked younger and kinder without the hat, but his next words chilled her. "I did not want Henri to marry you." He stopped abruptly. For a heartbeat, Jeanette was struck dumb by his frankness. "My husband regretted Your Grace's disapproval," she finally said in a small voice. The Duke ignored Jeanette's words. "He should have married Lisette of Picard. She had money, lands, tenants. She would have brought our family great wealth. In times of trouble, wealth is a—" He paused, trying to find the right word. "It is a cushion. You, madame, have no cushion." "Only Your Grace's kindness," Jeanette said. "Your son is my charge," the Duke said. "He will be raised in my household and trained in the arts of war and civilization, as befits his rank." "I am grateful." Jeanette was tired of groveling. She wanted some sign of affection from the Duke, but ever since he had walked to the hearth, he would not meet her eyes. Now, suddenly, he turned on her. "There is a lawyer called Bella in La Roche-Derrière." "Indeed, Your Grace." "He tells me your mother was a Jewess." He spat the last word. Jeanette gaped at him. For a few heartbeats, she was unable to speak. Her mind was reeling with disbelief that Bella would say such a thing. But at last she managed to shake her head. "She was not," she protested. "He tells us, too," the Duke went on, "that you petitioned Edward of England for the rents of Plabennec." "What choice did I have?" "And that your son was made a ward of Edward's?" the Duke asked pointedly. Jeanette opened and closed her mouth. The accusations were coming so thick and fast, she did not know how to defend herself. It was true that her son had been named a ward of King Edward's, but it had not been Jeanette's doing. Indeed, she had not even been present when the Earl of Northampton made that decision. But before she could protest or explain, the Duke spoke again. "Bella tells us," he said, "that many in the town of La Roche-Derrière have expressed satisfaction with the English occupiers." "Some have," Jeanette admitted. "And that you, madame, have English soldiers in your own house, guarding you." "They forced themselves on my house," she said indignantly. "Your Grace must believe me. I did not want them there." The Duke shook his head. "It seems to us, madame, that you have given a welcome to our enemies. Your father was a vintner, was he not?" Jeanette was too astonished to say anything. It was slowly dawning on her that Bella had betrayed her utterly. Yet she still clung to the hope that the Duke would be convinced of her innocence. "I offered them no welcome," she insisted. "I fought against them." "Merchants," the Duke said, "have no loyalties other than to money. They have no honor. Honor is not learned, madame. It is bred. Just as you breed a horse for bravery and speed, or a hound for agility and ferocity, so you breed a nobleman for honor. You cannot turn a plough horse into a destrier, nor a merchant into a gentleman. It is against nature and the laws of God." He made the sign of the cross.
Your son is the Count of Armorica, and we shall raise him in honor, but you, madame, are the daughter of a merchant and a Jewess."
"It is not true," Jeanette protested.
"Do not shout at me, madame," the Duke said icily. "You are a burden on me. You dare to come here, tricked out in fox fur, expecting me to give you shelter. What else? Money? I will give your son a home, but you, madame, I shall give you a husband."
He walked towards her, his feet silent on the deerskin rugs.
"You are not fit to be the Count of Armorica's mother. You have offered comfort to the enemy. You have no honor.
Jeanette began to protest again, but the Duke slapped her hard across the cheek.
"You will be silent, madame," he commanded. "Silent."
He pulled at the laces of her bodice, and when she dared to resist, he slapped her again.
"You are a whore, madame,"
the Duke said, then lost patience with the intricate cross laces, retrieved the discarded scissors from the rug, and used them to cut through the laces to expose Jeanette's breasts. She was so astonished, stunned, and horrified that she made no attempt to protect herself. This was not Sir Simon Jekyll, but her liege lord, the king's nephew, and her husband's uncle.
"You are a pretty whore, madame," the Duke said with a sneer. "How did you enchant Henri? Was it Jewish witchcraft?"
"No," Jeanette whimpered. "Please, no." The Duke unhooked his gown, and Jeanette saw he was naked beneath. "No," she said again. "Please, no." The Duke pushed her hard so that she fell on the bed. His face still showed no emotion, not lust, not pleasure, not anger. He hauled her skirts up, then knelt on the bed and raped her with no sign of enjoyment. He seemed, if anything, angry, and when he was done, he collapsed on her, then shuddered. Jeanette was weeping. He wiped himself on her velvet skirt.
"I shall take that experience," he said, "as payment of the missing rents from Plebenec."
He crawled off her, stood and hooked the ermine edges of his gown.
"You will be placed in a chamber here, madame, and tomorrow I shall give you in marriage to one of my men-at-arms. Your son will stay here, but you will go wherever your new husband is posted."
Jeanette was whimpering on the bed. The Duke grimaced with distaste, then crossed the room and kneeled on the prie-dieu.
"Arrange your gown, madame," he said coldly, "and compose yourself."
Jeanette rescued enough of the cut laces to tie her bodice into place, then looked at the Duke through the candle flames. "You have no honor," she hissed. "You have no honor." The Duke ignored her. He rang a small handbell, then clasped his hands and closed his eyes in prayer. He was still praying when the priest and a servant came and, without a word, took Jeanette by her arms and walked her to a small room on the floor beneath the Duke's chamber. They thrust her inside, shut the door, and she heard a bolt slide into place on the far side. There was a straw-filled mattress and a stack of brooms in the makeshift cell, but no other furnishing. She lay on the mattress and sobbed till her broken heart was raw. The wind howled at the window, and rain beat on its shutters, and Jeanette wished she was dead. The city's cockerels woke Thomas to a brisk wind and pouring rain that beat on the cart's leaking cover. He opened the flap and sat watching the puddles spread across the cobbles of the inn yard. No message had come from Jeanette, nor, he thought, would there be one. Will Skeet had been right. She was as hard as mail, and now she was in her proper place, which in this cold, wet dawn was probably a deep bed in a room warmed by a fire, tended by the Duke's servants. She would have forgotten Thomas. And what message, Thomas asked himself, had he been expecting? A declaration of affection? He knew that was what he wanted, but he persuaded himself he merely waited so Jeanette could send him the pass signed by the Duke. Yet he knew he did not need a pass. He must just walk east and north and trust that the Dominican's robe protected him. He had little idea how to reach Flanders, but had a notion that Paris lay somewhere close to that region, so he reckoned he would start by following the River Seine, which would lead him from Rennes to Paris. His biggest worry was that he would meet some real Dominican on the road who would quickly discover Thomas had only the haziest notion of the Brotherhood's rules and no knowledge at all of their hierarchy. But he consoled himself that Scottish Dominicans were probably so far from civilization that such ignorance would be expected of them. He would survive, he told himself. He stared at the rain spattering in the puddles. Expect nothing from Jeanette, he told himself, and to prove that he believed that bleak prophecy, he readied his small baggage. It irked him to leave the mail coat behind, but it weighed too much, so he stowed it in the wagon, then put the 3 sheaves of arrows into a sack. The 72 arrows were heavy, and their points threatened to tear open the sack, but he was reluctant to travel without the sheaves that were wrapped in hempen bowstring cord, and he used one cord to tie his knife to his left leg where, like his money pouch, it was hidden by the black robe. He was ready to go, but the rain was now hammering the city like an arrow storm. Thunder crackled to the west. The rain pelted on the thatch, poured off the roofs, and overflowed the water butts to wash the inn's night soil out of the yard. Midday came, heralded by the city's rain-muffled bells, and still the city drowned. Wind-driven dark clouds wreathed the cathedral's towers, and Thomas told himself he would leave the moment the rain slackened, but the storm just became fiercer. Lightning flickered above the cathedral, and a clap of thunder rocked the city. Thomas shivered, awed by the sky's fury. He watched the lightning reflected in the cathedral's great west window, and was amazed by the sight. So much glass. Still it rained, and he began to fear that he would be trapped in the cut till the next day. And then, just after a peal of thunder seemed to stun the whole city with its violence, he saw Jeanette. He did not know her at first. He just saw a woman standing in the arched entrance to the inn's yard, with the water flowing about her shoes. Everyone else in Rennes was huddling in shelter, but this woman suddenly appeared, soaked and miserable. Her hair, which had been looped so carefully over her ears, hung lank and black down the sopping red velvet dress, and it was the dress that Thomas recognized. Then he saw the grief on her face. He clambered out of the wagon. "Jeanette!" She was weeping, her mouth distorted by grief. She seemed incapable of speaking, but just stood and cried. "My lady," Thomas said. "Jeanette!" "We must go," she managed to say. "We must go." She had used soot as a cosmetic about her eyes, and it had run to make grey streaks down her face. "We can't go in this," Thomas said. "We must go!" she screamed at him angrily. "We must go!" "I'll get the horse," Thomas said. "There's no time, there's no time." She plucked at his robe. "We must go, now!" She tried to tug him through the arch into the street. Thomas pulled away from her and ran to the wagon, where he retrieved his disguised bow and the heavy sack. There was a cloak of Jeanette's there, and he took that too, and wrapped it about her shoulders, but she did not seem to notice. "What's happening?" Thomas demanded. "They'll find me here, they'll find me," Jeanette declared in a panic, and she pulled him blindly out of the tavern's archway. Thomas turned her eastwards onto a crooked street that led to a fine stone bridge across the Seine, and then to a city gate. The big gates were barred, but a small door in one of the gates was open, and the guards in the tower did not care if some fool of a drenched friar wanted to take a madly sobbing woman out of the city. Jeanette kept looking back, fearing pursuit, but still did not explain her panic or her tears to Thomas. She just hurried eastwards, insensible to the rain, wind, and thunder. The storm eased towards dusk, by which time they were close to a village that had a poor excuse for a tavern. Thomas ducked under the low doorway and asked for shelter. He put coins on a table. "I need shelter for my sister," he said, reckoning that anyone would be suspicious of a friar traveling with a woman. "Shelter, food, and a fire," he said, adding another coin. "Your sister?" The tavern keeper, a small man with a face scarred by the pox and bulbous with wens, peered at Jeanette, who was crouched in the tavern's porch. Thomas touched his head, suggesting she was mad. "I am taking her to the shrine of St. Guinevere," he explained. The tavern keeper looked at the coins, glanced again at Jeanette, then decided the strange pair could have the use of an empty cattle byre. "You can put a fire there," he said grudgingly, "but don't burn the thatch." Thomas lit a fire with embers from the tavern's kitchen, then fetched food and ale. He forced Jeanette to eat some of the soup and bread, then made her go close to the fire. It took over 2 hours of coaxing before she would tell him the story, and telling it only made her cry again. Thomas listened, appalled. "So how did you escape?" he asked when she was finished. A woman had unbolted the room, Jeanette said, to fetch a broom. The woman had been astonished to see Jeanette there, and even more astonished when Jeanette ran past her. Jeanette had fled the citadel, fearing the soldiers would stop her, but no one had taken any notice of her, and now she was running away. Like Thomas, she was a fugitive, but she had lost far more than he. She had lost her son, her honor, and her future. "I hate men," she said. She shivered, for the miserable fire of damp straw and rotted wood had scarcely dried her clothes. "I hate men," she said again, then looked at Thomas. "What are we going to do?" "You must sleep," he said, "and tomorrow we'll go north." She nodded, but he did not think she had understood his words. She was in despair. The wheel of fortune that had once raised her so high had taken her into the utter depths. She slept for a time, but when Thomas woke in the grey dawn, he saw she was crying softly, and he did not know what to do or say, so he just lay in the straw until he heard the tavern door creak open, then went to fetch some food and water. The tavern keeper's wife cut some bread and cheese, while her husband asked Thomas how far he had to walk. "St. Guinefort's shrine is in Flanders," Thomas said. "Flanders?" the man said, as though it was on the far side of the moon. "The family doesn't know what else to do with her," Thomas explained, "and I don't know how to reach Flanders. I thought to go to Paris first." "Not Paris," the tavern keeper's wife said scornfully. "You must go to Fougères." Her father, she said, had often traded with the North Countries, and she was sure that Thomas's route lay through Fougères and Rouen. She did not know the roads beyond Rouen, but was certain he must go that far, though to begin, she said, he must take a small road that went north from the village. It went through woods, her husband added, and he must be careful, for the trees were hiding places for terrible men escaping justice. But after a few miles, he would come to the Fougères highway, which was patrolled by the Duke's men. Thomas thanked her, offered a blessing to the house, then took the food to Jeanette, who refused to eat. She seemed drained of tears, almost of life, but she followed Thomas willingly enough as he walked north. The road, deep-rutted by wagons and slick with mud from the previous day's rain, twisted into deep woods that dripped with water. Jeanette stumbled for a few miles, then began to cry. "I must go back to Rennes," she insisted. "I want to go back to my son." Thomas argued, but she would not be moved. He finally gave in, but when he turned to walk south, she just began to cry even harder. The Duke had said she was not a fit mother. She kept repeating the words. "Not fit, not fit," she screamed at the sky. "He made me his whore." Then she sank onto her knees beside the road and sobbed uncontrollably. She was shivering again, and Thomas thought that if she did not die of an ague, then the grief would surely kill her. "We're going back to Rennes," Thomas said, trying to encourage her. "I can't," she wailed. "He'll just whore me. Whore me!" She shouted the words, then began rocking back and forwards and shrieking in a terrible high voice. Thomas tried to raise her up, tried to make her walk, but she fought him. She wanted to die, she said. She just wanted to die. "A whore!" she screamed, and tore at the fox-fur trimmings of her red dress. "A whore! He said I shouldn't wear fur. He made me a whore." She threw the tattered fur into the undergrowth. It had been a dry morning, but the rain clouds were heaping in the east again, and Thomas was nervously watching as Jeanette's soul unraveled before his eyes. She refused to walk, so he picked her up and carried her, until he saw a well-trodden path going into the trees. He followed it, to find a cottage so low and with its thatch so covered with moss that at first he thought it was just a mound among the trees, until he saw blue-grey wood smoke seeping from a hole at its top. Thomas was worried about the outlaws who were said to haunt these woods, but it was beginning to rain again, and the cottage was the only refuge in sight.
so Thomas lowered Jeanette to the ground and shouted through the burrow-like entrance. An old man, white-haired, red-eyed, and with skin blackened by smoke, peered back at Thomas. The man spoke a French so thick with local words and accent that Thomas could scarcely understand him. But he gathered the man was a forester and lived here with his wife, and the forester looked greedily at the coins Thomas offered, then said that Thomas and his woman could use an empty pig shelter. The place stank of rotted straw and shit, but the thatch was almost rainproof, and Jeanette did not seem to care. Thomas raked out the old straw, then cut Jeanette a bed of bracken. The forester, once the money was in his hands, seemed little interested in his guests. But in the middle of the afternoon, when the rain had stopped, Thomas heard the forester's wife hissing at him, and a few moments later, the old man left and walked towards the road, but without any of the tools of his trade. No axe, billhook, or saw. Jeanette was sleeping, exhausted, so Thomas stripped the dead clover plants from his black bow, unlashed the crosspiece, and put back the horn tips. He strung the yew, thrust half a dozen arrows into his belt, and followed the old man as far as the road, and there he waited in a thicket. The forester returned towards evening with 2 young men, whom Thomas presumed were the outlaws of whom he had been warned. The old man must have reckoned that Thomas and his woman were fugitives, for though they carried bags and money, they had sought a hiding place, and that was enough to raise anyone's suspicions. A friar did not need to skulk in the trees, and women wearing dresses trimmed with torn remnants of fur did not seek a forester's hospitality. So doubtless the 2 young men had been fetched to help slit Thomas's throat, and then divide whatever coins they found on his body. Jeanette's fate would be similar, but delayed. Thomas put his first arrow into the ground between the old man's feet, and the second into a tree close by. "The next arrow kills," he said, though they could not see him, for he was in the thicket's shadows. They just stared wide-eyed at the bushes where he was hiding, and Thomas made his voice deep and slow. "You come with murder in your souls," he said, "but I can raise the Elka from the deeps of hell. I can make the devil's claws cut to your heart and have the dead haunt your daylight. You will leave the friar and his sister alone." The old man dropped to his knees. His superstitions were as old as time and scarcely touched by Christianity. He believed there were trolls in the forest and giants in the mist. He knew there were dragons. He had heard of black-skinned men who lived on the moon and who dropped to earth when their homes shrank to a sickle. He understood there were ghosts who hunted among the trees. All this he knew as well as he knew ash and larch, oak and beech, and he did not doubt that it was a demon who had spat the strangely long arrow from the thicket. "You must go," he told his companions. "You must go." The 2 fled, and the old man touched his forehead to the leaf mold. "I meant no harm." "Go home," Thomas said. He waited till the old man had gone, then he dug the arrow out of the tree, and that night he went to the forester's cottage, crawled through the low doorway, and sat on the earthen floor facing the old couple. "I shall stay here," he told them, "until my sister's wits are recovered. We wish to hide her shame from the world, that is all. When we go, we shall reward you. But if you try to kill us again, I shall summon demons to torment you, and I will leave your corpses as a feast for the wild things that lurk in the trees." He put another small coin on the earth floor. "You will bring us food each night," he told the woman, "and you will thank God that though I can read your hearts, I still forgive you." They had no more trouble after that. Every day the old man went off into the trees with his billhook and axe, and every night his wife brought her visitors gruel or bread. Thomas took milk from their cow, shot a deer, and thought Jeanette would die. For days she refused to eat, and sometimes he would find her rocking back and forth in the noxious shed and making a keening noise. Thomas feared she had gone mad forever. His father would sometimes tell him how the mad were treated, how he himself had been treated,
how starvation and beating were the only cures. "The devil gets into the soul," Father Ralph had said, "and he can be starved out or he can be thrashed out, but there is no way he will be coaxed out. Beat and starve, boy, beat and starve. It is the only treatment the devil understands." But Thomas could neither starve nor beat Jeanette, so he did his best by her. He kept her dry, he persuaded her to take some warm milk fresh from the cow. He talked with her through the nights, he combed her hair and washed her face, and sometimes, when she was sleeping and he was sitting by the shed and staring at the stars through the tangled trees, he would wonder whether he and the Harlequin had left other women as broken as Jeanette. He prayed for forgiveness. He prayed a lot in those days, and not to St. Guinevere, but to the Virgin and to St. George. The prayers must have worked, for he woke one dawn to see Jeanette sitting in the shed's doorway, with her thin body outlined by the bright new day. She turned to him, and he saw there was no madness in her face any more, just a profound sorrow. She looked at him a long time before she spoke. "Did God send you to me, Thomas?" "He showed me great favor if he did," Thomas replied. She smiled at that, the first smile he had seen on her face since Rennes. "I have to be content," she said very earnestly, "because my son is alive, and he will be properly cared for, and one day I shall find him." "We both shall," Thomas said. "Both?" He grimaced. "I have kept none of my promises," he said. "The lance is still in Normandy, Sir Simon lives, and how I shall find your son for you, I do not know. I think my promises are worthless, but I shall do my best." She held out her hand so he could take it, and she let it stay there. "We have been punished, you and I," she said, "probably for the sin of pride. The Duke was right. I am no aristocrat. I am a merchant's daughter, but thought I was higher. Now look at me." "Thinner," Thomas said, "but beautiful." She shuddered at that compliment. "Where are we?" "Just a day outside Rennes." "Is that all?" "In a pig shed," Thomas said, "a day out of Rennes." 4 years ago I lived in a castle," she said wistfully. "Plabennec wasn't large, but it was beautiful. It had a tower and a courtyard and 2 mills and a stream, and an orchard that grew very red apples." "You will see them again," Thomas said. "You and your son." He regretted mentioning her son, for tears came to her eyes, but she cuffed them away. "It was the lawyer," she said. "Lawyer?" "Bella. He lied to the Duke." There was a kind of wonderment in her voice that Bella had proved so traitorous. "He told the Duke I was supporting Duke Jean." "Then I will, Thomas. I will. I will support your Duke. If that is the only way to regain Plabennec and find my son, then I shall support Duke Jean." She squeezed Thomas's hand. "I'm hungry." They spent another week in the forest while Jeanette recovered her strength. For a while, like a beast struggling to escape a trap, she devised schemes that would give her instant revenge on Duke Charles and restore her son. But the schemes were wild and hopeless, and as the days passed, she accepted her fate. "I have no friends," she said to Thomas one night. "You have me, my lady." "They died," she said, ignoring him. "My family died. My husband died. Do you think I am a curse on those I love?" "I think," Thomas said, "that we must go north." She was irritated by his practicality. "I'm not sure I want to go north." "I do," Thomas said stubbornly. Jeanette knew that the further north she went, the further she went from her son, but she did not know what else to do, and that night, as if accepting that she would now be guided by Thomas, she came to his bracken bed, and they were lovers. She wept afterwards, but then made love to him again, this time fiercely, as though she could slake her misery in the consolations of the flesh. Next morning they left, going north. Summer had come, clothing the countryside in thick green. Thomas had disguised the bow again, lashing the crosspiece to the stave and hanging it with bindweed and willow herb instead of clover.
His black robe had become ragged, and no one would have taken him for a friar, while Jeanette had stripped the remains of the fox fur from the red velvet, which was dirty, creased, and threadbare. They looked like vagabonds, which they were, and they moved like fugitives, skirting the towns and bigger villages to avoid trouble. They bathed in streams, slept beneath the trees, and only ventured into the smallest villages when hunger demanded they buy a meal and cider in some slatternly tavern. If they were challenged, they claimed to be Bretons, brother and sister, going to join their uncle who was a butcher in Flanders, and if anyone disbelieved the tale, they were unwilling to cross Thomas, who was tall and strong and always kept his knife visible. By preference, though, they avoided villages and stayed in the woods, where Thomas taught Jeanette how to tickle the trout out of their streams. They would light fires, cook their fish, and cut bracken for a bed. They kept close to the road, though they were forced to a long detour to avoid the drum-like fortress of Saint-Aubin-du-Cormier, and another to skirt the city of Fougères, and somewhere north of that city they entered Normandy. They milked cows in their pastures, stole a great cheese from a wagon parked outside a church, and slept under the stars. They had no idea what day of the week it was, nor even what month it was anymore. Both were browned by the sun and made ragged by traveling. Jeanette's misery was dissolved in a new happiness, and nowhere more than when they discovered an abandoned cottage, merely cob walls of mud and straw that were decaying without a roof in a spinney of hazel trees. They cleared away the nettles and brambles and lived in the cottage for more than a week, seeing no one, wanting to see no one, delaying their future because the present was so blissful. Jeanette could still weep for her son, and spent hours devising exquisite revenges to be taken against the Duke, against Bella, and against Sir Simon Gicle. But she also revelled in that summer's freedom. Thomas had fitted his bow again so he could hunt, and Jeanette, growing ever stronger, had learned to pull it back almost to her chin. Neither knew where they were, and did not much care. Thomas's mother used to tell him a tale of children who ran away into the forest and were reared by the beasts. "They grow hair all over their bodies," she would tell him, "and have claws and horns and teeth." And now Thomas would sometimes examine his hands to see if claws were coming. He saw none. Yet if he was becoming a beast, then he was happy. He had rarely been happier, but he knew that the winter, even though far off, was nevertheless coming, and so, perhaps a week after midsummer, they moved gently north again, in search of something that neither of them could quite imagine. Thomas knew he had promised to retrieve a lance and restore Jeanette's son, but he did not know how he was to do either of those things. He only knew he must go to a place where a man like Will Skeet would employ him, though he could not talk of such a future with Jeanette. She did not want to hear about archers or armies or of men and mail coats, but she, like him, knew they could not stay forever in their refuge. "I shall go to England," she told him, "and appeal to your king." Out of all the schemes she had dreamed of, this was the only one that made sense. The Earl of Northampton had placed her son under the King of England's protection, so she must appeal to Edward and hope he would support her. They walked north, still keeping the road to Rouen in sight. They forded a river and climbed into a broken country of small fields, deep woods, and abrupt hills, and somewhere in that green land, unheard by either of them, the wheel of fortune creaked again. Thomas knew that the great wheel governed mankind. It turned in the dark to determine good or evil, high or low, sickness or health, happiness or misery. Thomas reckoned God must have made the wheel to be the mechanism by which he ruled the world while he was busy in heaven. And in that midsummer, when the harvest was being flailed on the threshing floors, and the swifts were gathering in the high trees, and the rowan trees were in scarlet berry, and the pastures were white with ox-eye daisies, the wheel lurched for Thomas and Jeanette. They walked to the wood's edge one day to check that the road was still in view. They usually saw little more than a man driving some cows to market, a group of women following with eggs and vegetables to sell. A priest might pass on a poor horse, and once they had seen a knight with his retinue of servants and men-at-arms. But most days the road lay white, dusty, and empty under the summer sun.
Yet this day it was full. Folk were walking southwards, driving cows and pigs and sheep and goats and geese. Some pushed handcarts, others had wagons drawn by oxen or horses, and all the carts were loaded high with stools, tables, benches, and beds. Thomas knew he was seeing fugitives. They waited till it was dark. Then Thomas beat the worst dirt off the Dominican's gown, and, leaving Jeanette in the trees, walked down to the road where some of the travellers were camping beside small, smoky fires. "God's peace be on you," Thomas said to one group. "We have no food to spare, Father," a man answered, eyeing the stranger suspiciously. "I am fed, my son," Thomas said, and squatted near their fire. "Are you a priest or a vagabond?" the man asked. He had an axe, and he drew it towards him protectively, for Thomas's tangled hair was wildly long, and his face as dark as any outlaw's. "I am both," Thomas said with a smile. "I have walked from Avignon," he explained, "to do penance at the shrine of St. Guinefour." None of the refugees had ever heard of the blessed Guinefour, but Thomas's words convinced them, for the idea of pilgrimage explained his woebegone condition, while their own sad condition, they made clear, was caused by war. They had come from the coast of Normandy, only a day's journey away, and in the morning they must be up early and travelling again to escape the enemy. Thomas made the sign of the cross. "What enemy?" he asked, expecting to hear that 2 Norman lords had fallen out and were ravaging each other's estates. But the ponderous wheel of fortune had turned unexpectedly. King Edward III of England had crossed the Channel. Such an expedition had long been expected, but the king had not gone to his lands in Gascony, as many had thought he would, nor to Flanders, where other Englishmen fought, but had come to Normandy. His army was just a day away, and at the news Thomas's mouth dropped open. "You should flee them, Father," one of the women advised Thomas. "They know no pity, not even for friars." Thomas assured them he would, thanked them for their news, then walked back up the hill to where Jeanette waited. All had changed. His king had come to Normandy. They argued that night. Jeanette was suddenly convinced that they should turn back to Brittany, and Thomas could only stare at her in astonishment. "Brittany?" he asked faintly. She would not meet his eyes, but stubbornly stared at the camp fires that burned all along the road, while further north, on the night's horizon, great red glows showed where larger fires burned, and Thomas knew that English soldiers must have been ravaging the fields of Normandy, just as the Harlequin had harrowed Brittany. "I can be near Charles if I'm in Brittany," Jeanette said. Thomas shook his head. He was dimly aware that the sight of the army's destruction had forced them both into a reality from which they had been escaping in these last weeks of freedom, but he could not connect that with her sudden wish to head back to Brittany. "You can be near Charles," he said carefully, "but can you see him? Will the Duke let you near him?" "Maybe he will change his mind," Jeanette said without much conviction. "And maybe he'll rape you again," Thomas said brutally. "And if I don't go," she said vehemently, "maybe I will never see Charles again, never." "Then why come this far?" "I don't know. I don't know." She was angry, as she used to be when Thomas first met her in La Roche-Derrien. "Because I was mad," she said sullenly. "You say you want to appeal to the king," Thomas said, "and he's here." He flung a hand towards the livid glow of the fires. "So appeal to him here." "Maybe he won't believe me," Jeanette said stubbornly. "And what will we do in Brittany?" Thomas asked. But Jeanette would not answer. She looked sulky and still avoided his gaze. "You can marry one of the Duke's men-at-arms," Thomas went on. "That's what he wanted, isn't it? A pliant wife of a pliant follower, so that when he feels like taking his pleasure, he can." "Isn't that what you do?" she challenged him, looking him in the face at last. "I love you," Thomas said. Jeanette said nothing. "I do love you," Thomas said, and felt foolish, for she had never said the same to him. Jeanette looked at the glowing horizon that was tangled by the leaves of the forest. "Will your king believe me?" she asked him. "How can he not?" "Do I look like a countess?" She looked ragged, poor, and beautiful.
"You speak like a countess," Thomas said, "and the king's clerks will make inquiries of the Earl of Northampton." He did not know if that was true, but he wanted to encourage her. Jeanette sat with her head bowed. "Do you know what the Duke told me? That my mother was a Jewess." She looked up at him, expecting him to share her indignation. Thomas frowned. "I've never met a Jew," he said. Jeanette almost exploded. "You think I have? You need to meet the devil to know he is bad? A pig to discover he stinks?" She began to weep. "I don't know what to do." "We shall go to the king," Thomas said. And next morning he walked north, and after a few heartbeats, Jeanette followed him. She had tried to clean her dress, though it was so filthy that all she could manage was to brush the twigs and leaf mold from the velvet. She coiled her hair and pinned it with slivers of wood. "What kind of man is the king?" she asked Thomas. "They say he's a good man." "Who says?" "Everyone. He's straightforward." "He's still English," Jeanette said softly, and Thomas pretended not to hear. "Is he kind?" she asked him. "No one says he's cruel," Thomas said, then held out a hand to silence Jeanette. He had seen horsemen in mail. Thomas had often found it strange that when the monks and scriveners made their books, they painted warfarers gaudy. Their squirrel hair brushes showed men in brightly colored surcoats or jupons, and their horses in brilliantly patterned trappers. Yet for most of the time war was grey, until the arrows bit, when it became shot through with red. Grey was the color of a mail coat, and Thomas was seeing grey among the green leaves. He did not know if they were Frenchmen or Englishmen, but he feared both. The French were his enemy, but so were the English, until they were convinced that he was English too, and convinced, moreover, that he was not a deserter from their army. More horsemen came from the distant trees, and these men were carrying bows, so they had to be English. Still Thomas hesitated, reluctant to face the problems of persuading his own side that he was not a deserter. Beyond the horsemen, hidden by the trees, a building must have been set on fire, for smoke began to thicken above the summer leaves. The horsemen were looking towards Thomas and Jeanette, but the pair were hidden by a bank of gorse, and after a while, satisfied that no enemy threatened, the troops turned and rode eastwards. End of Side 9. Side 10. Thomas waited till they were out of sight, then led Jeanette across the open land, into the trees, and out to where a farm burned. The flames were pale in the bright sun. No one was in sight. There was just a farm blazing, and a dog lying next to a duck pond that was surrounded by feathers. The dog was whimpering, and Jeanette cried out, for it had been stabbed in the belly. Thomas stooped beside the beast, stroked its head and fondled its ears, and the dying dog licked his hand and tried to wag its tail, and Thomas rammed his knife deep into its heart, so that it died swiftly. It would not have lived, he told Jeanette. She said nothing, just stared at the burning thatch and rafters. Thomas pulled out the knife and patted the dog's head. "Go to St. Guinevere," he said, cleaning the blade. "I always wanted a dog when I was a child," he told Jeanette, "but my father couldn't abide them." "Why?" "Because he was strange." He sheathed the knife and stood. A track, imprinted with hoof marks, led north from the farm, and they followed it cautiously, between hedges thick with cornflowers, ox-eye, and dogwood. They were in a country of small fields, high banks, sudden woods, and lumpy hills, a country for ambush, but they saw no one until, from the top of a low hill, they glimpsed a squat stone church tower in a valley, and then the unburned roofs of a village, and after that the soldiers. There were hundreds of them, camped in the fields beyond the cottages, and more in the village itself. Some large tents had been raised close to the church, and they had the banners of nobles planted by their entrances. Thomas still hesitated, reluctant to finish these good days with Jeanette. Yet he knew there was no choice, and so, bow on his shoulder, he took her down to the village. Men saw them coming, and a dozen archers, led by a burly man in a mail hauberk, came to meet them. "What the hell are you?" was the burly man's first question. His archers grinned wolfishly at the sight of Jeanette's ragged dress. "You're either a bleeding priest who stole a bow," the man went on, "or an archer who filched a priest's robe."
I'm English, Thomas said. The big man seemed unimpressed. Serving who? I was with Will Skeet in Brittany, Thomas said. Brittany? The big man frowned, not certain whether or not to believe Thomas. Tell them I'm a countess, Jeanette urged Thomas in French. What's she saying? Nothing, Thomas said. So what are you doing here? The big man asked. I got cut off from my troop in Brittany, Thomas said weakly. He could hardly tell the truth, that he was a fugitive from justice, but he had no other tale prepared. I just walked. It was a lame explanation, and the big man treated it with the scorn it deserved. What you mean, lad, he said, is that you're a bloody deserter. I'd hardly come here if I was, would I? Thomas asked defiantly. You'd hardly come here if you just got lost, the man pointed out. He spat. You'll have to go to Scoresby. Let him decide what you are. Scoresby? Thomas asked. You've heard of him? The big man asked belligerently. Thomas had heard of Walter Scoresby, who, like Skeet, was a man who led his own band of men-at-arms and archers. But Scoresby did not have Skeet's good reputation. He was said to be a dark-humoured man, but he was evidently to decide Thomas's fate, for the archers closed around him and walked the pair towards the village. She your woman? One of them asked Thomas. She's the Countess of Armorica, Thomas said. And I'm the bloody Earl of London, the archer retorted. Jeanette clung to Thomas's arm, terrified of the unfriendly faces. Thomas was equally unhappy. When things had been at their worst in Brittany, when the Harlequin were grumbling and it was cold, wet and miserable, Skeet liked to say, Be happy you're not with Scoresby. And now, it seemed, Thomas was. We hang deserters, the big man said with relish. Thomas noted that the archers, like all the troops he could see in the village, wore the red cross of St. George on their tunics. A great crowd of them were gathered in a pasture that lay between the small village church and a Cistercian monastery or priory that had somehow escaped destruction, for the white-robed monks were assisting a priest who said mass for the soldiers. Is it Sunday? Thomas asked one of the archers. Tuesday, the man said, taking off his hat in honor of the sacraments. St. James's Day. They waited at the pasture's edge, close to the village church, where a row of new graves suggested that some villagers had died when the army came, but most had probably fled south or west. One or two remained. An old man, bent double from work and with a white beard that almost reached the ground, mumbled along with the distant priest, while a small boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, tried to draw an English bow to the amusement of its owner. The mass ended, and the mail-clad men climbed from their knees and walked towards the tents and houses. One of the archers from Thomas's escort had gone into the dispersing crowd, and he now reappeared with a group of men. One stood out because he was taller than the others and had a new coat of mail that had been polished so it seemed to shine. He had long boots, a green cloak, and a gold-hilted sword with a scabbard wrapped in red cloth. The finery seemed at odds with the man's face, which was pinched and gloomy. He was bald, but had a forked beard, which he had twisted into plaits. That's Scoresby, one of the archers muttered, and Thomas had no need to guess which of the approaching soldiers he meant. Scoresby stopped a few paces away, and the big archer who had arrested Thomas smirked. A deserter, he announced proudly. Says he walked here from Brittany. Scoresby gave Thomas a hard glance, and Jeanette a much longer look. Her ragged dress revealed a length of thigh and a ripped neckline, and Scoresby clearly wanted to see more. Like Will Skeet, he had begun his military life as an archer and had risen by dint of shrewdness, and Thomas guessed there was not much mercy in his soul's mix. Scoresby shrugged. If he's a deserter, he said, then hang the bastard. He smiled. But we'll keep his woman. I'm not a deserter, Thomas said, and the woman is the Countess of Armorica, who is related to the Count of Blois, nephew to the King of France. Most of the archers jeered at this outrageous claim, but Scoresby was a cautious man, and he was aware of a small crowd that had gathered at the churchyard's edge. 2 priests and some men-at-arms wearing noblemen's escutcheons were among the spectators, and Thomas's confidence had put just enough doubt in Scoresby's mind. He frowned at Jeanette, seeing a girl who looked at first glance like a peasant, but despite her tanned face, She was undoubtedly beautiful, and the remnants of her dress suggested she had once known elegance. "She's who?" Scoresby demanded. "I told you who she was," Thomas said belligerently, "and I will tell you more. Her son has been stolen from her, and her son is a ward of our king's. She has come for his majesty's help." Thomas hastily told Jeanette what he had said, and to his relief she nodded her agreement. Scoresby gazed at Jeanette, and something about her increased his doubt. "Why are you with her?" he asked Thomas. "I rescued her," Thomas said. "He says," a voice spoke in French from the crowd, and Thomas could not see the speaker, who was evidently surrounded by men-at-arms, all wearing a green and white livery. "He says that he rescued you, madame. Is that true?" "Yes," Jeanette said. She frowned, unable to see who was questioning her. "Tell us who you are," the unseen man demanded. "I am Jeanette, Dowager Countess of Armorica." "Your husband was who?" The voice suggested a young man, but a very confident young man. Jeanette bridled at the tone of the question, but answered it. "Henri Chenier, Comte d'Armorique." "And why are you here, madame?" "Because Charles of Blois has kidnapped my child," Jeanette answered angrily. "A child who was placed under the protection of the King of England." The young man said nothing for a while. Some in the crowd were edging nervously away from the liveried men-at-arms who surrounded him, and Scoresby was looking apprehensive. "Who placed him under that protection?" he eventually asked. "William Boone," Jeanette said, "Earl of Northampton." "I believe her," the voice said, and the men-at-arms stepped aside so that Thomas and Jeanette could see the speaker, who proved to be scarce more than a boy. Indeed, Thomas doubted he had even begun to shave, though he was surely full-grown, for he was tall, taller even than Thomas, and had only stayed hidden because his men-at-arms had been wearing green and white plumes in their helmets. The young man was fair-haired, had a face slightly burned by the sun, was dressed in a green cloak, plain breeches, and a linen shirt, and nothing except his height explained why men were suddenly kneeling on the grass. "Down!" Scoresby hissed at Thomas, who, perplexed, went on one knee. Now only Jeanette, the boy, and his escort of 8 tall men-at-arms were standing. The boy looked at Thomas. "Did you really walk here from Brittany?" he asked in English, though, like many noblemen, his English was touched with a French accent. "We both did, sire," Thomas said in French. "Why?" he demanded harshly. "To seek the protection of the King of England," Thomas said, "who is the guardian of my lady's son, who has been treacherously taken prisoner by England's enemies." The boy looked at Jeanette with much the same wolfish appreciation that Scoresby had shown. He might not shave, but he knew a beautiful woman when he saw one. He smiled. "You are most welcome, madame," he said. "I knew of your husband's reputation. I admired him, and I regret that I will never have a chance to meet him in combat." He bowed to Jeanette, then untied his cloak and walked to her. He placed the green cape over her shoulders to cover the torn dress. "I shall ensure, madame," he said, "that you are treated with the courtesy your rank demands, and will vow to keep whatever promises England made on your son's behalf." He bowed again. Jeanette, astonished and pleased by the young man's manner, put the question that Thomas had been wanting answered. "Who are you, my lord?" she asked, offering a curtsy. "I am Edward of Woodstock, madame," he said, offering her his arm. It meant nothing to Jeanette, but it astonished Thomas. "He is the king's eldest son," he whispered to her. She dropped to one knee, but the smooth-cheeked boy raised her and walked her towards the priory. He was Edward of Woodstock, Earl of Chester, Duke of Cornwell and Prince of Wales. And the wheel of fate had once again spun Jeanette high. The wheel seemed indifferent towards Thomas. He was left alone, abandoned. Jeanette walked away on the prince's arm and did not so much as glance back at Thomas. He heard her laugh. He watched her. He had nursed her, fed her, carried her, and loved her. And now, without a thought, she had discarded him. No one else was interested in him. Scoresby and his men, cheated of a hanging, had gone to the village. and Thomas wondered just what he was supposed to do.
"God damn," he said aloud.
He felt conspicuously foolish in his tattered robe.
"God damn,"
he said again. Anger, thick as the black humor that could make a man sick, rose in him. But what could he do? He was a fool in a ragged robe, and the prince was the son of a king. The prince had taken Jeanette to the low grassy ridge where the big tent stood in a colorful robe. Each tent had a flagpole, and the tallest flew the quartered banner of the Prince of Wales, which showed the golden lions of England on the 2 red quarters and golden fleur-de-lis on the 2 blue. The fleur-de-lis were there to show the king's claim to the French throne, while the whole flag, which was that of England's king, was crossed with a white-toothed bar to show that this was the banner of the king's eldest son. Thomas was tempted to follow Jeanette to demand the prince's help, but then one of the lower banners, the one furthest away from him, caught the small warm wind and sluggishly lifted its folds. He stared at it. The banner had a blue field and was slashed diagonally with a white band. 3 rampant yellow lions were emblazoned on either side of the bar, which was decorated with 3 red stars that had green centers. It was a flag Thomas knew well, but he scarcely dared believe that he was seeing it here in Normandy, for the arms were those of William Boone, Earl of Northampton. Northampton was the king's deputy in Brittany, yet his flag was unmistakable, and Thomas walked towards it, fearing that the wind-rippled flag would turn out to be a different coat of arms, similar to the Earl's but not the same. But it was the Earl's banner, and the Earl's tent, in contrast to the other stately pavilions on the low ridge, was still the grubby shelter made from 2 worn-out sails. A half-dozen men-at-arms wearing the Earl's livery barred Thomas's way as he neared the tent. "Have you come to hear his lordship's confession or put an arrow in his belly?" one asked. "I would speak to his lordship," Thomas said, barely suppressing the anger provoked by Jeanette's abandonment of him. "But will he talk to you?" the man asked, amused at the ragged archer's pretensions. "He will," Thomas said with a confidence he did not entirely feel. "Tell him the man who gave him La Roche-Derrien is here," he added. The man-at-arms looked startled. He frowned, but just then the tent flap was thrown back and the Earl himself appeared, stripped to the waist, to reveal a muscled chest covered in tight red curls. He was chewing on a goose-bone and peered up at the sky as though fearing rain. The man-at-arms turned to him, indicated Thomas, then shrugged as if to say he was not responsible for a madman showing up unannounced. The Earl stared at Thomas. "Good God," he said after a while. "Have you taken orders?" "No, my lord." The Earl stripped a piece of flesh from the bone with his teeth. "Thomas, ain't that right?" "Yes, my lord." "Never forget a face," the Earl said, "and I have cause to remember yours, though I hardly expected you to fetch up here. Did you walk?" Thomas nodded. "I did, my lord." Something about the Earl's demeanor was puzzling, almost as though he was not really surprised to see Thomas in Normandy. "Will told me about you," the Earl said. "Told me all about you. So Thomas, my modest hero from La Roche-Derrien, is a murderer, eh?" He spoke grimly. "Yes, my lord," Thomas said humbly. The Earl threw away the stripped bone, then snapped his fingers, and a servant tossed him a shirt from within the tent. He pulled it on and tucked it into his hose. "God's teeth, boy, do you expect me to save you from Sir Simon's vengeance? You know he's here." Thomas gaped at the Earl, said nothing. Sir Simon Jekyll was here, and Thomas had just brought Jeanette to Normandy. Sir Simon could hardly hurt her so long as she was under the prince's protection, but Sir Simon could harm Thomas well enough, and delight in it. The Earl saw Thomas blanch, and he nodded. "He's with the king's men because I didn't want him, but he insisted on travelling because he reckons there's more plunder to be had in Normandy than Brittany, and I dare say he's right. But what will truly put a smile on his face is the sight of you. Ever been hanged, Thomas?" "Hanged, my lord?" Thomas asked vaguely. He was still reeling from the news that Sir Simon had sailed to Normandy. He had just walked all this way to find his enemy waiting. "Sir Simon will hang you," the Earl said with indecent relish. "He'll let you strangle on the rope, and there'll be no kindly soul tugging on your ankles to make it quick. You could last an hour, 2 hours, in utter agony. You could choke for even longer. One fellow I hanged lasted from matins till prime and still managed to curse me. So I suppose you want my help, yes? Thomas belatedly went onto one knee. You offered me a reward after La Roche-Derrien, my lord. Can I claim it now? The servant brought a stool from the tent, and the Earl sat, his legs set wide. Murder is murder, he said, picking his teeth with a sliver of wood. Half Will Skeet's men are murderers, my lord, Thomas pointed out. The Earl thought about that, then reluctantly nodded. But they're pardoned murderers, he answered. He sighed. I wish Will was here, he said, evading Thomas's demand. I wanted him to come, but he can't come until Charles of Blois is put back into his cage. He scowled at Thomas. If I give you a pardon, the Earl went on, then I make an enemy out of Sir Simon. Not that he's a friend now, but still, why spare you? For La Roche-Derrien, Thomas said. Which is a great debt, the Earl agreed. A very great debt. We'd have looked bloody fools if we hadn't taken that town, miserable goddamn place though it be. God's teeth, boy, but why didn't you just walk south? Plenty of bastards to kill in Gascony. He looked at Thomas for a while, plainly irritated by the undeniable debt he owed the archer and the nuisance of paying it. He finally shrugged. I'll talk to Sir Simon, offer him money, and if it's enough, he'll pretend you're not here. As for you, he paused, frowning as he remembered his earlier meetings with Thomas. You're the one who wouldn't tell me who your father was, ain't I right? I didn't tell you, my lord, because he was a priest. The Earl thought that was a fine jest. God's teeth, a priest! So you're a devil's whelp, are you? That's what they say in Guyenne, that the children of priests are the devil's whelps. He looked Thomas up and down, amused again at the ragged robe. They say the devil's whelps make good soldiers, he said. Good soldiers and better whores. I suppose you've lost your horse? Yes, my lord. All my archers are mounted, the Earl said, then turned to one of his men-at-arms. Find the bastard a sway-back nag till he can filch something better, then give him a tunic and offer him to John Armstrong. He looked back to Thomas. You're joining my archers, which means you'll wear my badge. You're my man, devil's whelp, and perhaps that will protect you if Sir Simon wants too much money for your miserable soul. I shall try to repay your lordship, Thomas said. Pay me, boy, by getting us into Caen. You got us into La Roche-Derrien, but that little place is nothing compared to Caen. Caen is a true bastard. We go there tomorrow, but I doubt we'll see the backside of its walls for a month or more, if ever. Get us into Caen, Thomas, and I'll forgive you a score of murders. He stood, nodded a dismissal, and went back into the tent. Thomas did not move. Caen, he thought. Caen. Caen was the city where Sir Guillaume d'Evêque lived, and he made the sign of the cross, for he knew fate had arranged all this. Fate had determined that his crossbow arrow would miss Sir Simon Jekyll, and it had brought him to the edge of Caen, because fate wanted him to do the penance that Father Hobbart demanded. God, Thomas decided, had taken Jeanette from him because he had been slow to keep his promise. But now the time for the keeping of promises had come, for God had brought Thomas to Caen. Part 2. Normandy. The Earl of Northampton had been summoned from Brittany to be one of the Prince of Wales's advisers. The prince was just 16, though John Armstrong reckoned the boy was as good as any grown man. Ain't nothing wrong with young Edward, he told Thomas. Knows his weapons. Headstrong, maybe, but brave. That, in John Armstrong's world, was high praise. He was a 40-year-old man-at-arms who led the Earl's personal archers and was one of those hard, common men that the Earl liked so much. Armstrong, like Skeet, came from the North Country and was said to have been fighting the Scots since he had been weaned. His personal weapon was a falchion, a curved sword with a heavy blade as broad as an axe, though he could draw a bow with the best of his troop. He also commanded 70 of hoblars, light horsemen mounted on shaggy ponies and carrying spears. They don't look up to much,
he said to Thomas, who was gazing at the small horsemen, who all had long, shaggy hair and bent legs, but they're rare at scouting. We send swarms of yon bastards into the Scottish hills to find the enemy. Be dead else. Armstrong had been at La Roche-Derrien and remembered Thomas's achievement in turning the town's river flank, and because of that he accepted Thomas readily enough. He gave him a lice-ridden Hookton, a padded jacket that might stop a feeble sword cut, and a short surcoat, a jupon, that had the Earl's stars and lions on its breast and bore the cross of St. George on its right sleeve. The Hookton and jupon, like the breeches and arrow bag that completed Thomas's outfit, had belonged to an archer who had died of the fever shortly after reaching Normandy. "You can find yourself better stuff in Caen," Armstrong told him, "if we ever get into Caen." Thomas was given a sway-backed grey mare that had a hard mouth and an awkward gait. He watered the beast, rubbed her down with straw, then ate red herrings and dry beans with Armstrong's men. He found a stream and washed his hair, then twisted the bow-cord round the wet pigtail. He borrowed a razor and scraped off his beard, tossing the stiff hairs into the stream so that no one could work a spell on them. It seemed strange to spend the night in a soldier's encampment and to sleep without Jeanette. He still felt bitter about her, and that bitterness was like a sliver of iron in his soul when he was roused in the night's dark heart. He felt lonely, chill, and unwanted as the archers began their march. He thought of Jeanette in the prince's tent, and remembered the jealousy he had felt in Rennes when she had gone to the citadel to meet Duke Charles. She was like a moth, he thought, flying to the brightest candle in the room. Her wings had been scorched once, but the flame drew her still. The army advanced on Caen in 3 battles, each of about 4,000 men. The king commanded one, the Prince of Wales the second, while the third was under the orders of the Bishop of Durham, who much preferred slaughter to sanctity. The prince had left the encampment early to stand his horse beside the road, where he could watch his men pass in the summer dawn. He was in black armor, with a lion crest on his helm, and escorted by a dozen priests and 50 knights. As Thomas approached, he saw Jeanette was among those green and white blazoned horsemen. She was wearing the same colors, a dress of pale green cloth with white cuffs, hems, and bodice, and was mounted on a palfrey that had silver curb chains, green and white ribbons plaited into its mane, and a white saddle-cloth embroidered with the lions of England. Her hair had been washed, brushed, and coiled, then decorated with cornflowers, and as Thomas came nearer, he thought how ravishing she looked. There was a radiant happiness on her face, and her eyes were bright. She was just to one side of the prince and a pace or so behind him, and Thomas noted how often the boy turned to speak to her. The men in front of Thomas were pulling off their helmets or caps to salute the prince, who looked from Jeanette to them, sometimes nodding or calling out to a knight he recognized. Thomas, riding his borrowed horse that was so small his long legs hung almost to the ground, raised a hand to greet Jeanette. She stared into his smiling face, then looked away without showing any expression. She spoke with a priest, who was evidently the prince's chaplain. Thomas let his hand drop. "If you're a bloody prince," the man beside Thomas said, "you get the cream, don't you? We get lice, and he gets that." Thomas said nothing. Jeanette's dismissal had left him embarrassed. Had the last weeks been a dream? He twisted in his saddle to look at her, and saw she was laughing at some comment of the prince's. "You are a fool," Thomas told himself, "a fool." And he wondered why he felt so hurt. Jeanette had never declared any love for him, yet her abandonment bit his heart like a snake. The road dropped into a hollow where sycamore and ash grew thick, and Thomas, turning again, could not see Jeanette. "There'll be plenty of women in Caen," an archer said with relish. "If we ever get in," another commented, using the 5 words that were always spoken whenever the city was named. The previous night, Thomas had listened to the campfire talk that had all been about Caen. It was, he gathered, a huge city, one of the biggest in France, and protected by a massive castle and a great wall. The French, it seemed, had adopted a strategy of retreating into such citadels rather than face England's bowmen in the open fields, and the archers feared they could be stranded in front of Caen for weeks.
The city could not be ignored, for if it was left untaken, its huge garrison would threaten the English supply lines. So Caen had to fall, and no one believed it would be easy, though some men reckoned the new guns that the king had fetched to France would knock down the city's ramparts as easily as Joshua's trumpets had felled the walls of Jericho. The king himself must have been skeptical of the guns' power, for he had decided to scare the city into surrender by the sheer numbers of his army. The 3 English battles moved eastward on every road, track, or stretch of meadow that offered a path, but an hour or 2 after dawn, the men-at-arms who served as marshals began halting the various contingents. Sweaty horsemen galloped up and down the masses of men, shouting at them to move into a rough line. Thomas, wrestling with his stubborn mare, understood that the whole army was being formed into a huge crescent. A low hill lay in front, and a hazy smear beyond the hill betrayed the thousands of cooking fires in Caen. When the signal was given, the whole clumsy crescent of mailed men would be advanced to the hilltop, so that the defenders, instead of seeing a few English scouts trickle from the woods, would be presented with an overwhelming host, and, to make the army seem double its real size, the marshals were pushing and shouting the camp followers into the curved line. Cooks, clerks, women, masons, farriers, carpenters, scullions, anyone who could walk, crawl, ride, or stand, was being added to the crescent, and a host of bright flags were raised over those bemused masses. It was a hot morning, and the leather and mail made men and horses sweat. Dust blew in the wind. The Earl of Warwick, marshal of the host, was galloping up and down the crescent, red-faced and cursing, but slowly the cumbersome line formed to his satisfaction. "When the trumpet sounds," a knight shouted at Armstrong's men, "advance to the hilltop. When the trumpet sounds, not before." That army of England must have looked like 20,000 men when the trumpets tore the summer sky with their massed defiance. To Caen's defenders it was a nightmare. One moment the horizon was empty, even though the sky beyond had long been blanched by the dust kicked up by hoofs and boots, and then there was a sudden host, a horde, a swarm of men glinting iron-hard in the sun, and topped by a forest of raised lances and flags. The whole north and east of the city was ringed with men who, when they saw Caen, gave a great roar of incoherent scorn. There was plunder ahead of them, a whole rich city waiting to be taken. It was a fine and famous city, bigger even than London, and that was the biggest city in England. Caen, indeed, was one of the great cities of France. The conqueror had endowed it with the wealth he stole from England, and it still showed. Within the city walls, the church spires and towers stood as close as the lances and flags in Edward's army, while on either side of the city were 2 vast abbeys. The castle lay to the north, its ramparts, like the pale stone of the city's high walls, hung with war banners. The English roar was answered with a defiant cheer from the defenders, who clustered thick on the ramparts. So many crossbows, Thomas thought, remembering the heavy bolts thumping from La Roche-Derrien's embrasures. The city had spread beyond its walls, but instead of placing the new houses beside the ramparts, as most towns did, here they had been built on a sprawling island that lay to the south of the old city. Formed by a maze-like tangle of tributaries that fed the 2 main rivers which flowed by Caen, the island had no walls, for it was protected by the waterways. It needed such protection, for even from the hilltop, Thomas could see that the island was where the wealth of Caen lay. The old city, within its high walls, would be a labyrinth of narrow alleys and cramped houses, but the island was filled with large mansions, big churches, and wide gardens. But even though it appeared to be the wealthiest part of Caen, it did not seem to be defended. No troops were visible there. Instead, they were all on the ramparts of the old city. The town's boats had been moored on the island's bank, opposite the city wall, and Thomas wondered if any of them belonged to Sir Guillaume d'Evêque. The Earl of Northampton, released from the prince's entourage, joined John Armstrong at the head of the archers, and nodded towards the city walls. "Brute of a place, John," the Earl said cheerfully. "Formidable, my lord," Armstrong grunted. "The island's named for you," the Earl said glibly. "For me?" Armstrong sounded suspicious. "It's the Île Saint-Jean," the Earl said. then pointed to the nearer of the two abbeys, a great monastery that was surrounded by its own ramparts, which were joined to the city's higher walls. "The Abbé aux Hommes," the Earl said. "You know what happened when they buried the Conqueror there? They left him in the abbey for too long, and when the time came to put him in the vault, he was rotted and swollen. His body burst, and they reckon the stench of it drove the congregation out of the abbey." "God's vengeance, my lord," Armstrong said stoically. The Earl gave him a quizzical look. "Maybe," he said uncertainly. "There's no love of William in the North Country," Armstrong said. "Long time ago, John. Not so long that I won't spit on his grave," Armstrong declared, then explained himself. "He might have been our king, my lord, but he were no Englishman." "I suppose he wasn't," the Earl allowed. "Time for revenge," Armstrong said loudly enough for the nearest archers to hear. "We'll take him, we'll take his city, and we'll take his goddamn women." The archers cheered, though Thomas did not see how the army could possibly take Caen. The walls were huge and well buttressed with towers, and the ramparts were thick with defenders who looked as confident as the attackers. Thomas was searching the banners for the one showing 3 yellow hawks on a blue field, but there were so many flags, and the wind was stirring them so briskly, that he could not pick Sir Guillaume d'Evêque's 3 hawks from the other gaudy ripples that swirled beneath the embrasures. "So what are you, Thomas?" The Earl had dropped back to ride beside him. His horse was a big destrier, so that the Earl, despite being much shorter than Thomas, towered above him. He spoke in French. "English or Norman?" Thomas grimaced. "English, my lord, right to my sore arse." It had been so long since he had ridden that his thighs were chafed raw. "We're all English now, aren't we?" The Earl sounded mildly surprised. "Would you want to be anything else?" Thomas asked, and looked around at the archers. "God knows, my lord, I wouldn't want to fight them." "Nor me," the Earl grunted. "And I've saved you a fight with Sir Simon. Or rather, I've saved your miserable life. I talked to him last night. I can't say he was very willing to spare you a throttling, and I can't blame him for that." The Earl slapped at a horsefly. "But in the end, his greed overcame his hatred of you. You've cost me my share of the prize money for the Countess's 2 ships, young Thomas. 1 ship for his dead squire, and the other for the hole you put in his leg." "Thank you, my lord," Thomas said effusively. He felt the relief surge through him. "Thank you," he said again. "So you're a free man," the Earl said. "Sir Simon shook on it, a clerk made a note of it, and a priest witnessed it. Now, for God's sake, don't go and kill another of his fellows." "I won't, sir," Thomas promised. "And you're in my debt now," the Earl said. "I acknowledge it, my lord." The Earl made a dismissive noise, suggesting it was unlikely Thomas could ever pay such a debt. Then he shot the archer a suspicious look. "And speaking of the Countess," he went on, "you never mentioned that you brought her north?" "It didn't seem important, my lord." "And last night," the Earl continued, "after I'd growled at Jekyll for you, I met her ladyship in the prince's quarters. She says you treated her with complete chivalry. It seems you behaved with discretion and respect." "Is that really true?" Thomas reddened. "If she says so, my lord, it must be true." The Earl laughed, then touched his spurs to his destrier. "I've bought your soul," he said cheerfully, "so fight well for me." He curved away to rejoin his men-at-arms. "He's all right, our Billy," an archer said, nodding at the Earl. "A good one." "If only they were all like him," Thomas agreed. "How come you talk French?" the archer asked suspiciously. "Picked it up in Brittany," Thomas said vaguely. The army's vanguard had now reached the cleared space in front of the walls, and a crossbow bolt slammed into the turf as a warning. The camp followers, who had helped give the illusion of overwhelming force, were pitching tents on the hills to the north, while the fighting men spread out in the plain that surrounded the city. Marshals were galloping between the units, shouting that the prince's men were to go clear about the walls to the Abbey aux Dames on the city's further side. It was still early, about mid-morning, and the wind brought the smell of Caen's cooking fires as the Earl's men marched past deserted farms. The castle loomed above them. They went to the western side of the town. The Prince of Wales, mounted on a big black horse and followed by a standard-bearer and a troop of men-at-arms, galloped to the convent, which, because it lay well outside the city walls, had been abandoned. He would make it his home for the duration of the siege, and Thomas, dismounting where Armstrong's men would camp, saw Jeanette following the prince. Following him like a puppy, he thought sourly, then chided himself for jealousy. Why be jealous of a prince? A man might as well resent the sun or curse the ocean. There are other women, he told himself as he hobbled his horse in one of the abbey pastures. A group of archers was exploring the deserted buildings that lay close to the convent. Most were cottages, but one had been a carpenter's workshop and was piled with wood shavings and sawdust, while beyond it was a tannery, still stinking of the urine, lime, and dung that cured the leather. Beyond the tannery was nothing but a waste ground of thistles and nettles that ran clear to the city's great wall, and Thomas saw that dozens of archers were venturing into the weeds to stare at the ramparts. It was a hot day, so that the air in front of the wall seemed to shiver. A small north wind drifted some high clouds and rippled the long grass that grew in the ditch at the base of the battlements. About 100 archers were in the waste ground now, and some were within long crossbow range, though no Frenchman shot at them. A score of the inquisitive bowmen were carrying axes to cut firewood, but morbid curiosity had driven them towards the ramparts instead of outwards to the woods, and Thomas now followed them, wanting to judge for himself what horrors the besiegers faced. The screeching sound of ungreased axles made him turn to see 2 farm wagons being dragged towards the convent. They both held guns, great bulbous things with swollen metal bellies and gaping mouths. He wondered if the gun's magic could blast a hole through the city's ramparts, but even if it did, then men would still have to fight through the breach. He made the sign of the cross. Maybe he would find a woman inside the city. He had almost everything a man needed. He had a horse, he had a Hookton, he had his bow and arrow bag. He just needed a woman. Yet he did not see how an army twice the size could cross Caen's great walls. They reared up from their boggy ditch like cliffs, and every 50 paces there was a conical roofed bastion that would give the garrison's crossbowmen the chance to slash their quarrels into the flanks of the archers. It would be carnage, Thomas thought, far worse than the slaughter that had occurred each time the Earl of Northampton's men had assailed the southern wall at La Roche-Derrien. More and more archers came into the waste ground to stare at the city. Most were just inside crossbow range, but the French still ignored them. Instead, the defenders began hauling in the gaudy banners that hung from the embrasures. Thomas looked for Sir Guillaume's 3 hawks, but could not see them. Most of the banners were decorated with crosses or the figures of saints. One showed the keys of heaven, another the Lion of St. Mark, and a third had a winged angel scything down English troops with a flaming sword. That banner disappeared. "What the hell are the goddamn bastards doing?" an archer asked. "The bastards are running away," another man said. He was staring at the stone bridge that led from the old city to the Ile Saint-Jean. That bridge was thronged with soldiers, some mounted, most on foot, and all of them streaming out of the walled city onto the island of big houses, churches, and gardens. Thomas walked a few paces southwards to get a better view, and saw crossbowmen and men-at-arms appear in the alleys between the island's houses. "They're going to defend the island," he said to anyone in earshot. By now, carts were being pushed over the bridge, and he could see women and children being chivied on their way by men-at-arms. More defenders crossed the bridge, and still more banners vanished from the walls, until there was only a handful left. The big flags of the great lord still flew from the castle's topmost towers, and pious banners hung down the keep's long walls, but the city ramparts were almost bare, and there must have been 1,000 archers from the Prince of Wales's battle watching those walls now. They should have been cutting firewood, building shelters or digging latrines, but a slow suspicion was dawning on them that the French were not planning to defend both the city and the island,
but only the island, which meant the city had been abandoned. That seemed so unlikely that no one even dared mention it. They just watched the city's inhabitants and defenders crowd across the stone bridge, and then, as the last banner was hauled from the ramparts, someone began walking towards the nearest gate. No one gave any orders. No prince, earl, constable, or knight ordered the archers forward. They simply decided to approach the city themselves. Most wore the Prince of Wales's green and white livery, but a good few, like Thomas, had the Earl of Northampton's stars and lions. Thomas half expected crossbowmen to appear and greet the straggling advance with a terrible volley of spitting quarrels, but the embrasures stayed empty, and that emboldened the archers, who saw birds settling on the crenellations, a sure sign that the defenders had abandoned the wall. The men with axes ran to the gate and started to hack at its timbers, and no crossbow bolts flew from the flanking bastions. The great walled city of William the Conqueror had been left unguarded. The axemen broke through the iron-studded planks, lifted the bar, and pulled the big gates open to reveal an empty street. A handcart with one broken wheel was abandoned on the cobbles, but no Frenchmen were visible. There was a pause as the archers stared in disbelief. Then the shouting began. "Havoc! Havoc!" The first thought was plunder, and men eagerly broke into the houses, but found little except chairs, tables, and cupboards. Everything of real value, like every person in the city, was gone to the island. End of Side 10. Side 11. Still more archers were coming into the city. A few climbed towards the open ground surrounding the castle, where 2 died from crossbow bolts spat from the high ramparts, but the rest spread through the city to find it bare, and so more and more men were drawn towards the bridge that spanned the river Odon and led to the Ile Saint-Jean. At the bridge's southern end, where it reached the island, there was a barbican tower that was thick with crossbows, but the French did not want the English getting close to the barbican, and so they had hastily thrown up a barricade on the bridge's northern side out of a great heap of wagons and furniture, and they had garrisoned the barrier with a score of men-at-arms, reinforced by as many crossbowmen. There was another bridge at the island's further side, but the archers did not know of its existence, and besides it was a long way off, and the barricaded bridge was the quickest route to the enemy's riches. The first white-fledged arrows began to fly. Then came the harder sounds of the enemy's crossbows discharging, and the crack of bolts striking the stones of the church beside the bridge. The first men died. There were still no orders. No man of rank was inside the city yet, just a mass of archers, as mindless as wolves smelling blood. They poured arrows at the barricade, forcing its defenders to crouch behind the overturned wagons. Then the first group of English gave a cheer and charged at the barricade with swords, axes, and spears. More men followed as the first tried to climb the ungainly pile. The crossbows banged from the barbican, and men were thrown back by the heavy bolts. The French men-at-arms stood to repel the survivors, and swords clashed on axes. Blood was slick on the bridge approach, and one archer slipped and was trampled underfoot by his colleagues going to the fight. The English were howling, the French were shouting, a trumpet was calling from the barbican, and every church bell on the Ile Saint-Jean was tolling the alarm. Thomas, having no sword of his own, was standing in the porch of a church which stood hard beside the bridge, from where he was shooting arrows up at the barbican tower. But his aim was obscured because a thatch in the old city was on fire and the smoke was curling over the river like a low cloud. The French held all the advantages. Their crossbowmen could shoot from the barbican and from the shelter of the barricade, and to attack them the English had to funnel onto the narrow bridge approach, which was littered with bodies, blood, and bolts. Still more enemy crossbowmen were stationed in the line of boats that was moored along the island's bank, stranded there by the falling tide, and the defenders of those boats, sheltered by the stout wooden gunwales, could shoot up at any archer foolish enough to show himself on those parts of the city wall that were not smoke-shrouded. More and more crossbowmen were coming to the bridge, until it seemed as if the air above the river was as thick with quarrels as a flock of starlings. Another rush of archers charged from the alleys to fill the narrow street leading to the barricade. They screamed as they charged.
They were not fighting with their bows, but rather with axes, swords, billhooks, and spears. The spears were mostly carried by the hobblers, many of them Welshmen, who uttered a high-shrieked howl as they ran with the archers. A dozen of the new attackers must have fallen to crossbow bolts, but the survivors leaped the bodies and closed right up to the barricade that was now defended by at least 30 men-at-arms and as many crossbowmen. Thomas ran and picked up the arrow bag of a dead man. The attackers were crammed up against the arrow-stuck barricade with little room to wield their axes, swords, and spears. The French men-at-arms stabbed with lances, hacked with swords, and flailed with maces, and as the front rank of archers died, the next rank was pushed onto the enemy weapons, and all the time the crossbow quarrels thumped down from the barbican's crenellated tower and flew up from the grounded ships in the river. Thomas saw a man reeling from the bridge with a crossbow bolt buried in his helmet. Blood poured down his face as he made a strange, incoherent mewing before falling to his knees and then slowly collapsing on the road, where he was trampled by another rush of attackers. A few English archers found their way onto the roof of the church, and they killed a half-dozen of the barricade's defenders before the crossbowmen on the barbican swept them away with stinging volleys. The bridge approach was thick with bodies now, so many corpses that they obstructed the charging English, and a half-dozen men began heaving the dead over the parapet. A tall archer, armed with a long-handled axe, managed to reach the barricade's summit, where he chopped the heavy blade again and again, beating down at a Frenchman who had ribbons on his helmet. But then he was struck by 2 crossbow belts, and he folded over, letting the axe fall and clutching at his belly, and the French hauled him down to their side of the barricade, where 3 men hacked at him with swords, then used the archer's own axe to sever his head. They thrust the bloody trophy onto a spear and waved it above the barricade to taunt their attackers. A mounted man-at-arms, wearing the Earl of Warwick's badge of a bear and ragged staff, shouted at the archers to retreat. The Earl himself was in the city now, sent by the king to pull his bowmen back from their unequal fight, but the archers were not willing to listen. The French were jeering them, killing them, but still the archers wanted to break through the bridge's defences and slake themselves on Caen's wealth. And so still more blood-maddened men charged at the barricade, so many that they filled the road as the bolts whipped down from the smoky sky. The attackers at the back heaved forward, and the men at the front died on French lances and blades. The French were winning. Their crossbow bolts were smacking into the crush of men, and those at the front began to push backwards to escape the slaughter, while those at the back still shoved forward, and the ones in between, threatened with a crushing death, broke through a stout wooden fence that let them spill off the bridge's approach onto a narrow strip of ground that lay between the river and the city walls. More men followed them. Thomas was still crouching in the church porch. He sent an occasional arrow up towards the barbican, but the thickening smoke hung like fog, and he could scarcely see his targets. He watched the men streaming off the bridge onto the narrow riverbank, but did not follow, for that seemed just another way of committing suicide. They were trapped there, with the high city wall at their backs and the swirling river in front, and the far bank of the river was lined with boats from which crossbowmen poured quarrels into these new and inviting targets. The spillage of men off the bridge opened the roadway to the barricade again, and newly arrived men who had not experienced the carnage of the first attacks took up the fight. A hobbler managed to climb onto an overturned wagon and stabbed down with his short spear. There were crossbow bolts sticking from his chest, but still he screeched and stabbed and tried to go on fighting, even when a French man-at-arms disemboweled him. His guts spilled out, but somehow he found the strength to raise the spear and give one last lunge before he fell into the defenders. A half-dozen archers were trying to dismantle the barricade, while others were throwing the dead off the bridge to clear the roadway. At least one living man, wounded, was thrown into the river. He screamed as he fell. "Get back, you dogs! Get back!" The Earl of Warwick had come to the chaos, and he flailed at men with his marshal's staff. He had a trumpeter sounding the 4 falling notes of the retreat, while the French trumpeter was blasting out the attack signal, brisk couplets of rising notes that stirred the blood, and the English and Welsh were obeying the French rather than the English trumpet. More men, hundreds of them, were streaming into the old city, dodging the Earl of Warwick's constables and closing on the bridge, where, unable to get past the barricade, they followed the men down to the riverbank, from where they shot their arrows at the crossbowmen in the barges. The Earl of Warwick's men started pulling archers away from the street that led to the bridge, but for every one they hauled away, another 2 slipped past.
A crowd of Caen's menfolk, some armed with nothing more than staves, waited beyond the Barbican, promising yet another fight if the barricade was ever overcome. A madness had gripped the English army, a madness to attack a bridge that was too well defended. Men went screaming to their deaths, and still more followed. The Earl of Warwick was bellowing at them to pull back, but they were deaf to him. Then a great roar of defiance sounded from the riverbank, and Thomas stepped out from the porch to see that groups of men were now trying to wade the river Odon. And they were succeeding. It had been a dry summer, the river was low, and the falling tide made it lower still, so that